Chapter 161, The Dream Stage. Flames licked the sacred columns, and thick smoke turned the hallowed halls a filthy gray-black. Monkey D. Dragon and his two companions set foot in Marineford and froze at the sight before them. This was not the heavily guarded abode of gods, it was a collapsing hell. Viha! Ivankov's huge head bobbed from side to side, his face alight with blatant excitement. Dragon! We haven't even moved, and the place is already burning. Has the world government's luck run out? Have the flames of revolution already spread? No. Dragon's voice was low, his green cloak flickering in the firelight. These are not our flames. His eyes swept over the panicked celestial dragons and their guards, who were scattering in every direction, incapable of organizing any effective resistance, only running blindly through the chaos. This was all wrong. A hard sense of vigilance rose in Dragon's chest. He quickly stifled Ivankov's premature elation and warned, "Don't be careless. The Revolutionary Army still has a long way to go, and the beasts on this sea haven't shown their true fangs yet." Bartholomew Kuma moved in silence behind them, his tall frame radiating a heavy, oppressive presence. Right now, though, his entire focus was locating Ginny. "There!" he barked, pointing toward a small courtyard ringed with guards. The three of them didn't hesitate. In an instant, they melted from their previous positions and reappeared at the courtyard's edge. Inside, several CP agents had Ginny backed into a corner, preparing to drag the toy away at the command of a celestial dragon. Their faces were flat with cold, efficient cruelty. Before any of them could move, a massive figure dropped into the courtyard to block Ginny's escape. "Pressure cannon!" Kuma shoved his palm forward. An invisible blast of air hit the agents like a battering ram. They were flung against a distant wall, the sickening crack of shattering bones following through the courtyard. "Death wink," Ivankov added with a sly grin. He winked, and a razor shockwave burst from his eye, staggering the remaining men and sending them sprawling to the ground. The whole skirmish was over in less than 10 seconds. Dragon materialized at Ginny's side. He didn't move a muscle, he simply stood there, and the air around him seemed to stop. The remaining guards dared not take another step. "Mr. Dragon! Kuma! Ivankov!" Ginny breathed at the sight of her companions, and the tautness that had knotted her nerves finally eased. A lone CP agent who had somehow survived fumbled for a transponder snail and croaked into it. "Revolutionary Army! Repeat, Revolutionary Army cadre spotted!" His words died on his lips. Without warning, an irresistible pressure rolled over all of Mary Geoise. From the sky, a massive hand, wrought from pure darkness and despair, reached down. Its outline could not be described. The grooves on its palm sounded like the wailing of billions of souls. Dragon looked up, and for the first time, the usually impassive man wore a grave, unsettled expression. This power, beneath that hand, time and space seemed to unravel. Ginny and Ivankov froze in place. Even their thoughts felt as if they would be swallowed by the darkness. Looking at the scene, there was only one person who would be brazen enough to act inside the Holy Land and possess such dreadful power. The wave-guiding king, Aaron Keel. Dragon made a decisive call. "Kuma," he growled, "take Ginny and Ivankov and leave. Now." He knew the Revolutionary Army wasn't ready to openly take on the world government, but there was no point in staying where he'd be captured or killed. Kuma's voice remained calm as ever. "What about you, Dragon?" he asked. Dragon's eyes cut through the smoke and flames to where a massive black hand, severed and dissolving under a cold blue light, hung in the air, and to the distant tower where figures faced each other. "I'll stay." He pulled his hood down to hide his face. "This fire may become the wind that sparks the world. I have to see which way that wind will blow." Uma said nothing more. He laid his enormous palms on Ginny and Ivankov. Poof. With a few soft noises, they turned into 3 streaks of light and shot up into the sky. Alone in the burning courtyard, Dragon's silhouette was quickly swallowed by smoke and darkness. At the other end of Mary Geoise, inside a lavish palace, Doflamingo stood in the shadows. His 10 fingers twitched and danced as if strumming an invisible harp. Below him, in the plaza, an almost absurd slaughter unfolded. Terrified cries of "Protect me!" rose and echoed, swallowed by the chaos as he watched on with detached amusement. "You useless lot! Kill him, now!" A celestial dragon shrieked, panic breaking his voice as he barked orders at the CP guards surrounding him. But the guards' bodies had gone haywire. They swung stiffly and began training their weapons on the other celestial dragon squad. Bang, bang, bang. Gunshots cracked and blood sprayed. "You dare attack my people!" The attacked celestial dragon roared, ordering his men to fight back. The CP elites, meant to be shields for these so-called gods, had become instruments for the gods to slaughter one another. Their faces were masks of pain and resistance, but their bodies obeyed the pull of unseen strings. The killing spread fast. Within minutes, most of the guards lay dead or wounded. The two celestial dragons, trembling with fury and fear, stared and pointed at each other. In a single, frantic motion, one leapt forward and clamped his teeth into the other's throat. The other snatched up a fallen guard's long saber and stabbed wildly. Blood, screams, and curses blended into a savage, hellish chorus. Foo-foo-foo-foo. Doflamingo shook with a violent, near-hysterical excitement, an uncontrollable laugh tearing out of him. Is this what a god looks like? One of his own, the kind he'd once worshipped, then coldly discarded him? Paradoxically, ugly, filthy, and fragile. Then a black, gargantuan hand loomed into the sky, blotting out the sun. The pressure that descended was instantaneous and terrifying. Doflamingo felt as if a mountain were pressing down on his chest, and even his laugh stuttered. Yet the madness in his eyes only intensified. This power, real power, power to crush the world beneath a heel. He lifted his head and, through the lenses of his sunglasses, stared with complete rapture at the severed giant hand, feeling the raw, terrifying energy that ripped free when it collided with Saint Nasujuro. Spreading his arms, he welcomed the burning hell Keel had forged for him. This was the stage he had always wanted. Chapter 162. 5 Elders, all assembled. Saint Nasujuro's bony hooves thudded against the tower parapet as he took his stance. His first-generation Kitetsu was leveled at Aaron Keel on the city wall. The blade's presence and the killing intent radiating from it made the air itself seem to freeze. "Aaron Keel," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "When Roger was executed, you spoke out of turn. The world government, considering your youth and ignorance, let it pass. Why now? Why insist on courting your own death?" The words were both a question and a final ultimatum. Aaron, however, laughed, a sound that rolled over the burning Holy Land with open contempt and insolence. "Why should I explain my life to anyone?" he scoffed. Before Nasujuro could reply, Aaron's figure vanished from the battlements. Nasujuro answered in kind. In an instant he became a streak of frosted light, launching himself from the tower. Clang! In midair, two figures met with a violent clash, one black, one white. Nidhogg, the black and gold Naginata, and the first-generation Kitetsu smashed together. The light they threw off instantly swallowed the towering flames below, turning the night bright as day. The blast of energy unfurled into a visible ring of displaced air that raced outward in every direction. Saint Nasujuro, man and horse fused into one, moved with impossible speed. His skeletal equine form left tearing after images with every step. Each swing of the first-generation Ketsu in his hand carried a bone-deep cold that felt like it could freeze the soul. Keel, however, showed no fear. Nidhogg carved broad, sweeping arcs. Every strike stirred wind and thunder, sending sound-wave roars that felt like tigers and dragons tearing the air. When the blades met, their collisions shattered that eerie cold with explosive clangs. With one ruthless follow-through, Keel redirected the force and sent Saint Nasujuro tumbling back. Nasujuro righted himself in midair, but his heart was a storm. This kid's strength was far beyond what he had expected. Power, speed, and hockey all pushed to the very pinnacle of the sea. This man was clearly a major threat to the world government. Before he'd even fully regained his footing, a deadly sense of danger swept in from his side and rear. An impossibly sharp, emerald green slash cut the air and was on his face in an instant. Saint Nasujuro's pupils narrowed. With no time to think, he brought his blade up to parry. The emerald edge met his sword with a thunderous boom, the shockwave driving him back dozens of meters. "Utterly shameless!" Nasujuro bellowed, furious. To be set upon 2-1, he, a pinnacle-level fighter, felt like a personal affront. He'd never imagined he'd be ganged up on like this. It was an insult. A light chuckle whispered in his ear. Keels, equal parts teasing and matter-of-fact. Shameless? What a joke. He let the words hang a beat, then added, "We are pirates." Before he could finish, a black shadow lunged in. Dracul Mahawk stood with his black blade Yoru in hand, his eyes as calm and fathomless as an ancient well. Countless inky sparks he summoned collided violently with the first-generation kaitetsu wielded by Saint Nasujuro. For a time, the air was a storm of flashing steel and bitter killing intent. Keel rose to join the fight, aiming to crush this Gorosei like a thunderbolt. The moment he moved, however, a far larger, more complex, 8-pointed star array burned into the night sky above him, casting an ominous crimson light. A non-human roar tore out from the formation, and a monstrous creature with a green face, fangs, and a body as vast as a mountain burst violently from the array. The war deity Mercury, Saint Saturn, had taken boar form. Its colossal mass struck Keel like a meteor. Alarm bells screamed in his head. With no time to think, Keel's arm muscles bulged as he poured armament hockey to the absolute limit and planted his sword, Nidhogg, to meet the blow. Boom! An overwhelming shock rolled up through the blade. The impact felt as if he'd been hit by a high-speed asteroid. Ain exploded through his arms, and the air was knocked out of his lungs. He became a streak of black, propelled backward like a shooting star. He tore past the still-burning Marijoas and slammed down onto the red line below, gouging a gruesome trench hundreds of meters long. Smoke and dust boiled up into the sky. "Damn it!" Keel spat. He hauled himself out of the crater, rubbing the numbness from his arm. The force of that hit tugged at an old, bitter memory, how he'd been flung into this world by an out-of-control truck. For a second he grinned crookedly through the pain. If that comparison made any sense, this pig had just hit harder than the truck that sent him here. Before he could steady himself properly, a new, primal sense of danger thudded up from under his boots. Keel didn't hesitate. He pushed off with his legs and launched himself upward. The ground exploded. A colossal creature, the size of a sea king, burst from the earth. It was a monstrous sandworm, a circular maw rimmed with layered teeth that could have crushed steel. The jaws snapped shut, tearing through rock and air as if they were nothing. As the beast reared, a thunderous voice seemed to fill the air. "Agricultural god of war, Jupiter Saint Pitt, sandworm form." Keel hung in midair, his old strength spent and the new not yet risen. Before he could find a foothold, the sky across from him suddenly darkened. Black flames poured forward like the overflowing waters of the river Styx, blotting out the sun. The fire was uncanny. Wherever it went, even space seemed to flare, emitting a sizzling, mournful cry. A voice cried out in invocation. "Environmental god of war, Mars Saint Maz, Itsumade form." Keel snorted. Twisting his body in midair, he brought the black and gold naginata around with one hand and drove it into the oncoming sea of flame. The slash, laced with black and red lightning, tore the sky like a divine judgment and split the black inferno in two. The severed walls of flame roared past on either side of him. Keel used the recoil to land lightly on a giant rock flattened by the blast. He tore off his already smoldering jacket, revealing a scarred muscular torso. Before he could even draw a breath, a faint whooshing sounded behind him. A sharp, glowing chela, a claw laced with venom that could melt flesh instantly, drove straight for the vital spot in Keel's back, his so-called back heart. Keel didn't even turn his head. He took a reverse grip on the naginata's long shaft, and with a single, almost unnatural backward twist, parried at an impossible angle. Clang! Metal rang harsh and bright. Sparks flew. Keel held the huge, dark, spider-like claw at bay. The attacker was an old ally from God Valley, Saturn, the scientific defense god of war, the Satan Saint, now in his Ushioni form. At the same moment, a cold sword light cut the air. Saint Nasujuro, who had been locked with Mahawk, abandoned his duel. He and his horse blurred several times and reappeared outside Marijoas. The chill from his first-generation kaitetsu dropped the surrounding temperature by several degrees. Above them, the enormous, strange bird continued to circle, refusing to disperse. The boar that had earlier knocked Keel back was thundering toward them now, each heavy step leaving a crater-sized footprint on the red line. Beneath the surface, the faint pressure of a sandworm could be felt, completely sealing off any chance of retreat. By now, 5 figures, some soaring high in the sky, others stalking across the earth, had locked onto Keel from every direction. Horsebone, boar, sandworm, Ushioni, and Itsumedi. They were monstrous forms, lifted from myth and legend, each radiating a terrifying aura that could make even gods tremble. The place had become a death trap. These were no ordinary foes. The Gorosei themselves, the world government's highest authority, Imu's strongest shield, were all present. 163. You are surrounded by me. Silence fell over the red line. 5 monstrous figures, like something ripped from myth, had turned this stretch of land into a death zone that would make gods tremble. Their terrifying auras braided together into a net that sealed sky and earth. The very air seemed to harden into blades, ready to shred anything that dared set foot here. The world government's highest authority, the Gorosei, had revealed their fiercest fangs. At the center of that circle, Kyle slowly rose to his full height. Flames and an eerie light sketched the contours of his scarred torso, every muscle hard as stone. He exhaled a mist stained with blood, and his golden eyes burned, not with fear, but with a long dormant, savage fire. How long had it been? How many years since he'd last felt his heart pound and his blood surge like this? He flexed his slightly numb wrists, cracked his neck with a series of sharp pops, then showed a wild, unrestrained smile. Kyle lifted his index finger, slowly tracing the 5 colossal figures before him, and finally brought the fingertip back to himself. Listen up. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every member of the Gorosei. You've been surrounded by me. Before he finished, his body broke apart into billions of motes of light and streaked through the darkness toward the death net the monsters had woven. Light wave, myriad star rain. As he charged, light particles peeled away from him and instantly reformed into a dense, rain-like barrage of luminous projectiles that sprayed out in 5 directions. Each shard burned and struck with enough force to pierce steel. For a moment, the whole sky was filled with that brilliant, deadly downpour. Screech! Saint Maz, the god of war for the environment, uttered a sharp cry, and the enormous Itsumare beat its wings with violent force, whipping up a gale strong enough to strip islands from the sea. It opened its beak and spat rolling black flames, wind fanning the fire riding the wind. Black flames slammed into the sky, full of pale rain-like light orbs. There was no thunderous explosion. The orbs were silently devoured the moment they touched the black fire, annihilated without a sound. The backlash threw up plumes of smoke and dust, swallowing a large swath of the battlefield. Kyle burst out of the choking haze, his target grotesquely obvious, the smallest of the 5, the ox demon called Satan's Saint. When picking persimmons, you take the softest, he muttered as he attacked. His black and gold naginata, Nidhogg, hummed with hockey and high-frequency sound waves. The blades sliced and compressed the air, detonating it with a concussive boom that carved a phoenix-shaped slash straight for Satan's Saint's face. Sound slash, exploding phoenix cry, but an even colder flash beat the attack. With a metallic clang, a pale figure streaked past like a ghost, Saint Nasujuro, and a first-generation Kitetsu met Kyle's blade with surgical precision. The impact bled an instant, bone-deep cold along the metal. Ice crawled over the ground in an instant, and a wall of glacier 100 meters high surged up from the earth, reaching to lock Kyle in its frozen grip. Satan's Saint scowled, a grotesque, almost human expression of annoyance, and bristled as if he'd been treated like a plaything. He flexed all 8 legs and clumsily lunged back, spraying a thick stream of purple venom. Where the venom passed, even the hard rock of the red line hissed and corroded. "Evil eye!" he bellowed. The instant Satan's Saint locked his gaze on Kyle, an invisible mental shock stabbed at Kyle's mind. Kyle's pupils narrowed, and a daze flickered across his vision, enough to shatter the morale of any commander or weaker opponent. He only faltered for a single heartbeat before his clarity snapped back. Kyle snorted, and a high-frequency vibration rippled outward from him, driving the corrosive venom back and striking the massive glacier at once. Cracks spidered through the supposedly indestructible ice. With a thunderous shudder, the glacier split apart, erupting into a skyful of jagged shards. "Light illusion mirage, thousandfold body," Kyle cried. Using the spray of ice and dust for cover, his silhouette divided, 2 figures, then 4, each one indistinguishable from the original. In an instant, over 1,000 Kyles armed with naginatas sprang up across the battlefield, swarming the Gorosei from every direction. The clones only possessed partial devil fruit powers and couldn't inflict serious harm. Their job was pure harassment. As soon as the flood of duplicates drew the Gorosei's attention, Kyle's real body materialized before Satan Saint as if by teleportation. Pfft! A flash of black and gold blade light sliced through the air and was gone. Satan Saint howled in pain as two of his spider-like lower limbs were severed clean at the base. Kyle barely had time to register the strike when a colossal, irresistible force slammed into him from the side. Saint Warcury's mountain-sized boar god form charged with an aura that threatened to crush anything in its path. On the other flank, Saint Nasujuro's icy blade struck again. Together they formed a flawless pincer. At that critical moment, an impossibly sharp, emerald-green slash tore through the air, dead center toward Saint Nasujuro. Boom! Saint Nasujuro had no choice but to parry. The force of the blow shoved him back several steps and shattered the pincer attack in an instant. On a nearby boulder, Hawkeye Mahawk stood watching, the tip of his black blade, Yoru, glowing with an eerie light. "Ha! Well done, little hawk!" Kyle roared, laughing. "I'll give you a raise when we get back." He pivoted to meet the charging Saint Warcury. Rather than fall back, Kyle advanced. Condensing Hao Shoku Haki and the power of the wave fruit into his blade, he lunged and slashed at those two massive tusks. "God avoidance!" he cried. Boom! Raging Hao Shoku Haki, braided through with explosive shockwaves, smashed into Saint Warcury's savage charge. The ground under Kyle's feet split, and he was hurled backward hundreds of meters, carving two deep furrows into the red line as he plowed through it. The clash of strength hadn't finished when a violent tremor ripped up from beneath him. Alarm bell ringing in his chest, Kyle abandoned his duel without hesitation and used the momentum to shoot skyward. The next instant, a sandworm's colossal maw, lined with jagged teeth, erupted from the spot where he had been standing. It snapped shut with brutal force, shattering the loose stones into dust. Saint Pitt, the god of war for agriculture, what a glutton. Kyle flipped through the air and landed lightly beside Mihawk. Back to back, the two of them stared coldly ahead. Horse skeleton, boar god, the sandworm, Itzamide, and the ox demon whose legs had only moments before been cut away. Satan Saint stood frozen, glaring at Kyle with pure fury. The severed stumps writhed as new flesh pushed up. In only a few breaths, two brand-new cheliped legs, pincer-like limbs, had regrown, as if nothing at all had happened. Chapter 164. The field expands. Satan Saint's shattered limbs had already regrown. Its uncanny regenerative power made it clear this fight was far beyond anything they had imagined. Kyle and Mihawk stood back to back, feeling an oppressive force that seemed to crush the space around them from every direction. "Hey, scared, little hawk?" Kyle's voice was light, teasing, slicing through the suffocating silence. Mihawk didn't answer. He lowered the black blade Yoru a fraction, his right hand closing harder on the hilt until his knuckles went white. Words were unnecessary. Action was the only reply. His silence wasn't an apology, but a statement. Nothing more needed to be said. A swordsman must always move forward. If he retreated even half a step out of fear today, the core of his swordsmanship would be tarnished. How could he ever hope to reach the summit of his art? Kyle's brash laugh rang out, bouncing among the ring of 5 monsters. "Then concentrate. That old bald man with the first-generation Kitetsu is yours. As for the other 4, I'll handle them." The words were barely out of his mouth when both men moved at once. Mihawk became a pitch-black streak, a living line slicing toward St. Nasujuro in the distance. But Kyle was faster still. He teleported to stand before Nasujuro in the blink of an eye. He didn't draw his sword. Instead, Kyle sheathed it, balled his right hand into a fist, and concentrated haki and shockwaves into the knuckles until the air around it trembled. Then he struck. Fistbone, galactic impact. A crimson cross of light bloomed in his palm and instantly swelled into an unstoppable torrent of force that smashed straight into St. Nasujuro. Having spent decades alongside Roger and constantly pursued by Old Man Garp, Nasujuro had picked up more than a few tricks. He shouldn't have been caught off guard. Still, his pupils narrowed. He hadn't expected Kyle to be the one to attack him, and he slammed his own blade up to meet the blow. The first-generation Kitetsu collided with the crimson impact with a thunderous crash. Boom! St. Nasujuro felt an irresistible force slam into his blade. He took the blow like a battering ram, his body turning into a streak of light as he was hurled backward, sent hurtling 1,000 meters into the air. Before he could right himself, a razor-black flash closed in. Hawkeye Myhawk had already followed. Two peak swordmasters, the undisputed summits of the world's swordsmanship, met on the red line. Their blades rang and shadows braided together. Each collision screamed across the sky. With Nasujiro flung out of the main fight, the balance on the ground shifted to 4 against 1. Fengwei, Sandworm, Gyuki, and Itsumade, 4 monsters, fanned out and closed on Kyle from all sides. "Come on, you old geezers!" Kyle roared, hoisting his black and gold Naginata, Nidhogg, high overhead. All-encompassing collapse, divine Naginata! The heavens answered. The night, already reddened by the fires below, was suddenly swallowed by an endless mass of dark clouds. At the center of that churning blackness, a colossal vortex spun, lightning cracking within it. From the eye of the storm, a spear of judgment, pure, crackling electricity given form, slowly began to take shape. Divine judgment fell in the next instant. The spear of judgment detonated, shattering into hundreds of thousands of writhing lightning dragons that screamed as they plummeted from the sky, turning the ground for hundreds of meters around into a seething sea of death by electricity. The thunder, like the wrath of Zeus himself, carried a force that made every living thing tremble to its core. Even the Gorosei would not face that world-shattering blow head-on. "Roar!" Saint Warcury answered the cry, its enormous Fengwei form bursting into motion and darting aside with astonishing speed. Saint Mars's wings blurred into black flame, streaking upward into the high sky. Saint Peter was even more direct. His colossal sandworm body dove into the earth and vanished without a trace. Only Saint stood his ground. Whether he was slow to move or utterly confident in his regenerative powers, he simply lifted his chalicery to shield his head and took several of the lightning dragon strikes squarely. Electricity danced across his body. Even protected by armament haki, the brutal, high-voltage current made him convulse. His once proud beard had been singed black and curled, filling the air with the strange, acrid smell of burnt protein. Saint was furious. The creature's grotesque, spider-like face contorted with rage, and its eyes flared with a savage light, 2 ominous red glints suddenly igniting. Kyle, about to press his advantage, was hit without warning by a ripping pain in his skull, as if 1,000 steel needles were being driven into his brain. He choked on a sound, his vision spinning. He staggered and nearly fell out of the sky. That brief lapse was all the opportunity Saint Warcury needed. With a thunderous roar, the enormous beast morphed into a black meteor. Its 2 massive, gleaming tusks smashed into Kyle's chest with bone-jarring force. His sternum felt like it would split. A mouthful of bright blood sprayed from his mouth as he was hurled backwards. He hadn't even had time to recover when the sky above went dark. Saint Mars shrieked as it dove down from altitude, talons wreathed in pitch-black flames, aimed straight for his head. Kyle gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his head and the heavy wounds across his chest. He roared and swung Nidhogg in a backhand strike. The blade met jagged claws with a metallic clang. The force of the impact threw him, hurling him down through the air. Directly below, St. Peter had already opened its abyssal maw. Yellow sand sprayed up as the earth split. A giant circular mouth, ringed with rows of serrated teeth, erupted from the ground and, before Kyle could react, swallowed him in a single gulp. Darkness and a deathly silence closed in at once. On the surface, St. Peter's vast sandworm body writhed as if content, then stiffened. In the middle of its enormous flank, a brilliant ring of light suddenly flared, then winked out. From deep inside, the beast came a strangled, barely controlled roar. "Die, for me!" A peculiar popping sound followed. "Poochie!" The ring of light cut through the mountain-sized creature. With that, St. Peter's colossal body was cleaved cleanly in 2. Foul-smelling blood and shredded entrails poured down like a storm as Kyle ripped free from the severed worm carcass, his body slick with gore and grime. He hovered in midair, gasping, golden pupils blazing with a fury none had seen before. A terrible wound split his chest down to the bone. Digestive acids had eaten at his skin and muscle, leaving him a ravaged, disheveled figure. Above them, St. Mars circled. On the ground, St. Warcury and Saint watched with predatory menace. St. Peter had been cleaved in 2. Its severed halves writhed independently, as if trying to fuse back together. Kyle raised his head slowly and let his gaze sweep across the 4 monsters. A strange, almost peaceful smile spread over his blood-stained face. His left hand, smeared with slime and gore, came up. He pressed his index and middle fingers together, forming a deliberate, peculiar seal. Domain expansion. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a final, irrevocable decree. Silence! There was no earth-shattering roar, no world-destroying flash. At the last syllable centered on him, the entire world tightened, not with spectacle, but with compression. Sound was the first thing to die. The slap of blood on the ground, the rasp of struggling flesh, even the wind in St. Mars's wings, all cut off as if someone had pressed a hand over the world's mouth. Motion followed. The twitching ends of St. Peter froze mid-weather, droplets hung suspended in the air, and the circling St. Mars hung like a statue. Within that hush, Kyle's golden eyes were the only living thing that moved freely. The domain did not need thunder to be absolute. It simply took everything and held it, absolute and inexorable. Sound vanished. Light vanished. The heat of flame, the flow of air, electromagnetic radiation, even the faintest tremors of space itself, in an instant they were all sucked away by an incomprehensible, irresistible force. A domain of absolute stillness, absolute darkness, and absolute silence had descended, the ultimate void. Out beyond the battlefield, above the red line at Mary Goi's, a perfectly black sphere, thousands of meters across, materialized out of nowhere. It swallowed every scrap of light and sound and expanded with terrifying speed, like a silent black hole dropping down from the heavens. Flames died the moment they touched its rim. Whirling dust froze solid when it met the boundary. Inside that dome, time itself seemed to stop. St. Warker's charging motion froze mid-stride. St. Mars's diving arc hung motionless in the air. The astonishment on the Satan Saint's face was locked in place. All their senses were stripped away. No sight, no sound, no perception of any kind, as if the world had been cut off from existence. Their thoughts hung suspended in an endless void, silent and immobile. No one inside the domain could will a single idea into motion. Memories, intentions, panic, prayer, all frozen like breath in winter air. Time itself seemed to have been cuffed and laid to rest. Only the domain's master, Kyle, remained exempt. He moved as if through syrup, each step deliberate, every motion measured against an invisible tide. In this pocket of existence he alone breathed, watched, and decided. Around him, heaven and earth held their breath. Leaves hovered mid-fall, droplets of water hung like glass beads in the air, and a flock of birds were statues stitched into the sky. Even the tiniest motions, the twitch of a finger, the flicker of an eyelid, had been arrested. Nothing stirred but Kyle. He felt the eerie weight of it all pressing on his shoulders. Absolute control, absolute silence. In the stillness, his choices echoed louder than they would have in a bustling world. Chapter 165. Dipped Beans. So cool. Inside the domain, every sound died. Time and space were stripped away. St. Warker's charging pose, St. Mars's diving arc, and Satan Saint's stunned expression were all frozen in an absolute soundless void. Kyle was the only thing that moved, a single point of color and motion in a still painting. He streaked through the darkness in a black and gold blur, carving an impossible Z-shaped line as he flashed past the four towering figures. When he reappeared at the center of the domain, a single, massive slash had been scored across each of them at once. St. Warker's waist and abdomen, Satan Saint's chest, St. Peter's previously shattered and still healing torso, and the root of St. Mars's wings. The wounds were savage and bone-deep, but not a drop of blood fell. Within the domain called silence, even the flow of blood was arrested. For a moment that stilled everything, it seemed the void had reached its limit. Then, faintly at first, a crackling noise began, a tiny cracking that quickly spread, like glass under stress. The pitch-black sphere that had enclosed them cracked like a mirror under too much strain, spiderweb fissures racing across its surface. In the next instant, the world slammed back into being. Light, sound, heat, airflow, everything that had been smothered, came surging back at once. The four Gorosei could move again, and their senses returned. But the relief was brief, followed by a delayed, soul-searing agony. Blood poured from their massive wounds like four crimson waterfalls. They roared. Pain turned to pure ferocity. The moment the domain shattered, they struck with a single, unprecedented combined assault. St. Warker launched a savage charge, St. Mars spat the underworld black flame. St. Peter drove a thorned sand spear up through the ground. Satan's saint unleashed a mental shockwave bursting from his eyes. 4 utterly different powers fused into one, a blistering torrent of destruction that closed off every avenue of escape. For the first time, a shadow of death truly fell over Kyle's heart. He felt it deep inside, an absolute, annihilating threat that would erase him completely, not leaving so much as a speck behind. Kyle drew a ragged breath, his chest heaving, and poured every ounce of power into the Nidhogg in his hand. "Dragon Slayer!" he roared. A compact black and gold dragon-shaped slash erupted from the blade and slammed into the oncoming torrent of destruction. Riding the recoil, Kyle became a streak of light and hurtled backward and to the side. Boom! A thunderous blast rolled over the red line. The whole plateau shuddered, the shockwave tore outward for thousands of meters. A distant section of Mary Geoise's outer wall crumbled under the aftershock, sending up a choking cloud of dust that blotted the sky. When the storm of energy finally eased, only a vast, bottomless crater marked the center of the battlefield. The 4 Gorosei stood at the rim of that pit, wounded and gasping. The single exchange had drained almost all their strength. For a moment they allowed themselves relief. The monster had been dealt with. Then all 4 pupils snapped tight with the same instinctive alarm. From the roiling dust at the pit's heart, a figure was slowly taking shape. He stood drenched in blood, the muscles of his upper body carved into stark relief. Bone-deep wounds ran across his chest and abdomen, yet he remained ramrod straight. The cool clarity in his golden eyes had gone. In its place burned a pure, crazed fighting light. How could this be? After taking that combined assault, he was still standing. Kyle bared his teeth in a blood-smeared grin and then vanished. Alarm bells rang in Satan Saint's chest, but he was too slow. A streak of black and gold blade light flashed past. Pfft! Satan Saint screamed as 6 of his newly regrown chelipeds, those pincer-like limbs, were severed clean at the roots. Pain convulsed him. He spat a mouthful of blood. He howled in fury. Saint Warkary's charge followed at once. His colossal form Bia ringed the force to crush mountains. Kyle didn't dodge. He merely turned his shoulder a fraction, taking the full brunt of the impact on his left side. Crack! Ribs snapped with a crisp sound. Kyle grunted, using the sheer force of the blow to launch himself like a cannonball into the sky. Caw! St. Mars had been waiting a long time. St. Mars seized the opening, its massive, bird-like body plunging from the clouds with talons aimed straight for Kyle's head. Midair, Kyle forced himself steady. He thrust his blood-smeared left hand toward the descending creature and clenched his fingers tight. For a moment, St. Mars faltered in its dive. Then an invisible field wrapped its bulk and the gravity around it spiked as if dozens of weights had been thrown on top of it. You might call it gravity or attraction, but it was neither. It was the third force, the I reckon force, the power of imposed will. Under that pressure, St. Mars' great body lurched and began to plummet uncontrollably, as if an invisible giant hand were driving it hard toward the earth. A fierce light flared in Kyle's eyes. He threw his hand up and roared to the sky, "Heavenly obstacle, trembling star!" The heavens answered. Clouds ripped open in a jagged tear, and something vast fell through. A meteor more than 100 meters across, wreathed in roaring flame and trailing a long tail of fire, hurtling straight for the struggling St. Mars. The creature shrieked and opened its beak, belching coiling black flames into the air as the burning meteor bore down. The black wave of flame shot upward and struck the meteor. The dark fire licked into the rock, eating it away until its mass dwindled to less than half. Still, it couldn't be stopped completely. With a thunderous crash, the remaining chunk slammed into St. Mars, driving it into the Red Line's ground and sending a spray of dust and debris into the air. St. Mars scrambled out of the crater, its body marked by several scorched patches but apparently uninjured. When it lifted its head, however, its bird-like pupils narrowed to pinpricks. Through a torn hole in the clouds overhead, something else was falling. Not a mere meteor, but a supermeteor, far larger than the first, like a small island tearing through the atmosphere. It hurtled down with apocalyptic force, roaring toward them. 166. I would like to call you the strongest. A meteor the size of a small island blazed through the sky, its heat scorching the atmosphere and turning the night an apocalyptic orange-red. Below, St. Mars scrambled out of the giant crater and, for the first time, saw genuine despair reflected in his huge bird-like eyes. There was no way he could take that impact. Just as the meteor was about to strike, a black afterimage slammed into it at impossible speed. A titanic roar tore through the air. St. Warcury, now a mountainous boar, was wreathed in black flame clouds. His two massive tusks became indestructible battering rams and drove straight into the heart of the meteor. Boom! The meteor's descent ground to a halt. The red line beneath Warcury's hooves split inch by inch. Spiderweb cracks raced outward, and the ground sagged into a depression several kilometers across. Warcury's muscles bulged, and veins stood out as he pushed every ounce of brute strength into holding the world steady. Cracks spidered across the meteorite's surface, and then with a thunderous roar, it exploded. A shower of burning fragments fell like scattered petals, gouging deep craters into the earth, but they still failed to kill St. Mars. Kyle wasn't surprised. He had never expected a purely physical strike to finish off a member of the Gorosei. Crippling them would be enough. He drifted down from the sky, calm and controlled. The instant his boots touched the ground, the battlefield changed. Whoosh! 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 Without warning, dozens of jagged spikes of redline rock erupted from beneath him, cutting off every likely landing spot. Simultaneously, a fierce wind rose, whipping the yellow sand into serrated blades that coalesced into an almost solid wall of dust and grit and swept toward him like a living thing. St. Peter, the so-called agricultural god of war, had been lying in wait underground, fighting a guerrilla war. He struck from below, striking at Kyle's footing and filling the air with blinding, cutting sand. Kyle danced through the spikes and through the sandstorm with ghost-like speed, each movement precise, each step calculated. Still, the attacks came from everywhere. The red line blades and the sand walls narrowed his options until escape felt impossible. A flicker of impatience crossed his face. Hiding underground like a cowardly turtle? Kyle sneered, then stopped dodging. He flipped his black and gold Naginata, Nidhogg, so the butt of the haft faced downward and slammed it hard into the ground. Earthquake. Ground roar wave. An almost invisible, ultra-high-frequency vibration radiated from the hilt and drove deep into the red line. The earth convulsed, hard rock layers heaved, fractured, and reassembled as if boiling. For kilometers around, the ground became a roiling sea of stone. A deep, agonized roar answered from below. The tremor blasted St. Peter, an enormous sandworm, out of the earth. It hit the churning surface awkwardly, trying to roll itself upright. Kyle was already gone from his previous position, closing the distance in an instant. A seven-colored arc of sword energy peeled off his blade and cut a brilliant path through the air, striking the worm's bulk with surgical precision. St. Peter never even had time to scream. The mountain-sized body was cleaved cleanly in two by that dazzling slash. A fetid spray of blood and entrails burst out as Kyle didn't let up. He twisted several times in midair, each motion sending fresh slashes through his foes. Puff, puff, puff! The sound of steel met flesh. St. Peter's already severed, worm-like body was torn into 7 or 8 pieces and scattered across the ground. When St. Warcury saw his comrade dismembered like that, raw fear finally flashed in the beastly depths of his eyes. In the distance, St. Nasujuro was locked in a desperate struggle with the swordsman Mahawk. Even though Mahawk seemed near exhaustion, his perfect swordcraft kept Nasujuro from breaking free quickly. Kyle, fighting 4 at once, had already grievously wounded St. Mars, crippled the Satan Saint, and now ripped St. Peter apart in only moments. What kind of monster was he? If Emu learned that all 5 of them, acting together, had been reduced to this state, the fallout would be unimaginable. A cold bead of sweat tracked down St. Warcury's forehead. He couldn't afford to stall any longer. Roar! The black clouds of flame around Warcury surged, rushing inward to wholly engulf his immense form. In the next instant, he became a black bolt of lightning, too fast for the naked eye, and slammed into Kyle. The attack carried all his strength and fury. Kyle's pupils shrank. He only had time to bring Nidhogg up horizontally across his chest to block. Boom! An enormous force hit him. It felt as if his arms had been struck head-on by a high-speed train. His bones groaned under the pressure. He spat a mouthful of hot blood. His body turned into a black meteor and was hurled backward, crashing into a cliff 1,000 meters away. The impact blew out a section of the mountainside. On another battlefield, the ground was scarred with crossing sword marks and glittering ice shards. Hawkeye Mihawk was down on one knee, bracing himself on his black blade Yoru and gasping for breath. His body was lacerated in dozens of places. The deepest wound ran from his left shoulder to his right abdomen, and blood had soaked the front of his clothes. Opposite him, Saint Nasujiro had abandoned his horsebone form and reverted to human shape. He still gripped the first-generation Kaitetsu, his breathing ragged, his once pristine white sacerdotal robes torn in several places. He studied the unsteady Mihawk, and for the first time something like mutual respect flickered across his usually indifferent face. Young swordsman. Saint Isambard V. Nasujiro's voice had lost its chill. It carried genuine admiration. In my long life I have seen countless swordsmen, but ones as exceptional as you are rare. In some ways, I must admit, you surpass me. He fell silent for a moment, eyes dropping to the black blade in Mihawk's hand. His tone turned solemn. In the art of the sword, I, Isambard V. Nasujiro, declare you the strongest. It was the highest praise, but praise could not alter reality. Mihawk was spent, near the end of his strength. In raw fighting power, he was already slightly lacking, and his haki and stamina were depleted. Against the Gorosei, who had lived for centuries and whose bodies were all but immortal, the gap remained significant. Slowly, Saint Nasujiro lifted the kitetsu, the black blade coming to rest a short distance from Mihawk's throat. However, this is where it ends. The cold blade hung in the air, ready to fall. At that exact moment, a sudden gust of wind blew up from nowhere, carrying with it countless razor-sharp slivers of air that whistled across the battlefield. Saint Nasujiro's face tightened. He stumbled back to avoid the cutting gust, found his footing, and searched for its source. There, standing inexplicably at Mihawk's side, was a man in a green cloak, his face marked with red tattoos. He didn't move, but seemed to merge with the wind itself, filling the space between earth and sky with an oppressive, bone-deep chill. The Revolutionary Army's commander-in-chief, Monkey D. Dragon, had arrived. 167. The wind is blowing hard rumble. The tumbling mountain rocks finally ground to a halt. 1,000 meters away on the battlefield, Saint Warcury stood breathing hard, his feral eyes fixed on the ruined slope. Dust still hung in the air, but from deep within the wreckage, a blinding golden light stabbed outward. It swelled and brightened until the whole area seemed bathed in something almost divine. Then, as if answering the light, countless stones were pushed aside by an invisible force. They hovered for a heartbeat, then exploded outward in every direction. The smoke and dust began to clear. From the heart of the shattered mountain, a colossal figure rose, 100 meters tall, a divine general in gleaming gold armor, its face noble and majestic. It was not a trick of light. Every plate of armor, every muscle line had the weight and solidity of real metal and flesh. Perched on the giant's brow stood Kyle. His clothes were ragged, a smear of blood clung to the corner of his mouth, but he showed no sign of disarray. He lifted a hand, flicked at a speck of dust that wasn't there, and his golden eyes looked down over the battlefield at the four monsters below with the calm, assessing gaze of a god inspecting the mortal world. Look closely. Saint Warcury's pupils shrank to pinpricks. The Satan Saint's broken chela, which had only just regenerated, stopped mid-motion, frozen. The aura coming off him, it was nothing like before. If the Kyle they'd seen earlier had been a razor-sharp spear, now he was an immovable, towering mountain of divinity that seemed to press down on heaven and earth itself. There were no wasted words. Then came a roar, not from his throat, but from the destructive waves that erupted from every inch of Saint Warcury's body and every strand of his mane. The sound shook the entire red line. The battlefield trembled under its fury. The dark shape tore through the sky, gouging a bottomless trench into the earth as it plowed forward. The aura of destruction hardened around him, as if determined to grind everything in its path to dust. Perched on the head of the divine general, Kyle's face remained impassive. He thought for a single instant, and the giant golden-armored figure obeyed. It lowered itself, its feet gouging 2 deep craters into the red line, then launched like a fired cannonball straight at Saint Warcury. 2 titans, one immense, one terrifyingly concentrated, collided with devastating force. The impact rent the air and the earth in a single, cataclysmic boom. There was no explosion, just a muffled, bone-deep thud that seemed like it could shatter a person from the inside. At the center of the impact, the air folded in on itself like crumpled paper, then snapped outward, forming a translucent, circular shockwave that swept the rubble and smoke clean off the ground. The golden-armored Divine General reached out with massive hands and seized both of St. Warcury's enormous gleaming tusks, stopping his charge dead. St. Warcury's beast-like eyes were bloodshot. His muscles bulged anew as he unleashed his power without reserve. Where the two titans fought, the earth could not hold. Spiderweb. Cracks were too tame a description. Ravines tens of meters across fanned out in every direction. They were evenly matched. The fierce light in St. Warcury's gaze flared as he prepared to push even harder. But the golden-armored Divine General suddenly lifted its right leg, and with crushing force its massive knee smashed into St. Warcury's snout. Bang! St. Warcury felt an irresistible force drive into his face. The blow threatened to flip his enormous head clean backward. Golden stars exploded behind his eyes. A hot surge of pain laced with humiliation blasted into his skull. Before he could steady himself, the Divine General's arm muscles bunched like coiling dragons. It twisted at the waist and, with a motion that seemed to move a mountain, swung the mountain like Fengshi in a single, crushing arc, smashing St. Warcury hard to the earth. The ground shuddered beneath the impact. St. Warcury barely had a moment to groan before light gathered in the Divine General's right hand. The light thickened and hardened until it became a gleaming halberd dozens of meters long, its spearhead crackling with braided lightning. Without hesitation, the Divine General gripped the weapon with both hands, raised it high, and funneled every ounce of force into the tip. The halberd drove down toward St. Warcury's exposed abdomen with murderous intent. The expected sound of flesh being torn open never came. Instead, clang, a shower of sparks erupted. The deafening ring of metal on metal drowned everything, replacing the gruesome impact everyone had braced for. For an instant, the battlefield stilled, every eye fixed on the impossible sound. The lightning halberd, an axe said to be able to pierce an island, had driven into St. Warcury's hide, but it sank less than a meter before grinding to an immovable halt. It was jammed solid, held by an almost unimaginable resilience. Fengshi's defenses were terrifying. A fierce light flared in St. Warcury's eyes. He opened his enormous jaws and let out a furious roar. Slowly he rolled his bloodshot beast eyes and fixed them on the Divine General standing on his head and the tiny figure perched atop that general. His expression mixed ferocity and contempt. "Little brat, you think you've broken my defense?" Before the words left him, the air between heaven and earth seemed to stop. The wind stalled. The atmosphere grew heavy and sticky, as if the entire sky had turned into a water-soaked sponge. Centered on St. Warcury's vast body, countless droplets condensed out of nowhere, coalescing and hissing as they gathered. Fengshi, the mythical beast that governs clouds and rain, was showing his true nature. Two gargantuan dragons, formed entirely of high-pressure water currents, roared and rose up from the ground. These creatures were no illusion. Each dragon's scale was a spinning vortex of water, a whirling blade with the power to shear metal and shatter jade. The water dragons ripped through the air with high, keening whistles, coiling tightly around the golden-armored Divine General from both sides, and then violently twisting and constricting. This was Fengshi, an art from ancient legend, the power to call and command rain. The great armor groaned under that crushing pressure. Metal creaked and seams complained as the force threatened to crush it inward. On the Divine General's helm, Kyle's robes whipped wildly in the turbulent wind. He felt the weight of the force trying to reduce the armor to scrap. Summoning his will, Kyle pushed back. The Divine General erupted in golden light. With that surge, it smashed the head off one of the water dragons and seized the opening to wrench free. It stepped back in a single motion, putting dozens of meters between itself and St. Warcury. The lightning halberd that had been gripped in its hand was released and dissolved into motes of light. In the next instant, the Divine General's huge palms closed slowly in front of its chest. Between them, a point of blinding white light appeared, like a newborn star. The surrounding air was sucked dry, shimmering with heat and distortion. Even the water vapor St. Worcury had summoned recoiled 3 steps from the scorching temperature. Watching from afar, Satan's Saint scraped his newly regenerated claw against the ground and cursed under his breath. This old pig really means business, and that brat Kyle isn't to be underestimated either. The light in the general's hands stretched and took shape, finally resolving into a gigantic sword of pure, brilliant white, denser and more radiant than the halberd it had used before. Where lightning had once danced along the blade, there was now only searing light and heat. Slash! Kyle's voice was soft, but it carried clearly to everyone. The golden-armored general gripped the searing sword, and without any flourish, raised it high. Then, with a force that seemed capable of scorching mountains and boiling seas, it brought the blade down in a single devastating stroke. A fierce light flared in St. Worcury's beast eyes. He forced the remaining water dragon and the newly reformed one to surge forward, fearlessly crashing toward the sword of light. On one side was raw, seething fury. On the other, an elemental, bone-chilling cold. Light and water met in midair with violent impact. Sizzle. After an ear-piercing shriek, everything fell utterly silent. In the span of a mere 1/100th of a second, an enormous volume of water vaporized, billowing into a dense white fog that blotted out the sky. Scalding steam rolled outward like a tsunami, swallowing the battlefield for miles. Vision, hearing, even spatial sense were smothered by that steaming, white hell. St. Worcury felt his heart stutter as a cold premonition rose in him. The very vapor he had produced had become the enemy's shield. In that choking fog, where you couldn't see your own hand, Kyle's plan had already succeeded. It was time. Run! Xiaoying! The clear shout sliced through the steaming tumult and cut all the way to another battlefield, where blades crossed and ice shards flew. St. Nasujuro's swing was halted by a sudden gust of wind. When the air cleared, Monkey D. Dragon was standing between Mihawk and him, expressionless as he faced the Gorosei, who held the first-generation Katetsu. Revolutionary Army, Nasujuro said, his voice icy. Dragon gave no reply. A shout from Kyle cut through the tension. Dragon's eyes flicked, and Mihawk, still leaning on his black blade, pushed himself upright. "Looks like the game's over," Mihawk said, his voice rough. In the next instant, both of them vanished from their positions, their bodies transforming into 2 streaks of light, one black, one green, that shot toward the roiling steam. Nasujuro's expression went dark. He moved to pursue, but a wall of wind rose up from the ground and barred his path. By the time he cleaved through it with a single slash, both figures had already been swallowed by the thick fog. Chapter 168, Get Away Safely. Visibility was down to less than half a meter in the thick, billowing steam. 3 figures hurtled forward as fast as they could, racing for the edge of the red line. "Yo, Monkey, long time no see," Aaron Keel called, breathing a little ragged but keeping his tone light. "Ginny and Kuma made it out right?" Monkey D. Dragon answered in a low voice. "They're safe." Aaron turned and grinned at Hawkeye Mihawk, a streak of blood darkening his smile. He laughed openly, pointing at Mihawk's ruined finery. The once noble garments hung in tatters, barely covering him. "Ha, Hawkeye, look at you. Anyone who didn't know better thinks some beggar from a backwater kingdom wandered into Mary Geoice to beg for scraps." Mihawk's stride didn't break, but the corner of his eye twitched. Dragon glanced too, then both of them caught sight of Aaron. He had even less left than Mihawk. Almost all of his clothes were gone, nothing more than a few strips clinging to his muscular frame. The wounds across his chest and stomach were cut down to the bone, dark blood still seeping from the gashes. The worst was the back of his head, a clean slice from temple to skull that sent a crimson fountain pulsing with each shudder of his body. Monkey and Mihawk raced beside him, breathless. Then, behind them, a roar erupted, full of raw, untamable fury. The ground itself trembled. A mountain of a figure smashed through everything in its path, an aura of crushing weight rolling off it. St. Worcury, in his Fengshi form, had gone almost feral. His eyes were blood-red, and reason seemed gone from him. Above, a streak of black flame trailed thick smoke, tattered wings beating as it pursued without mercy. Leading the charge was an even faster, colder presence. St. Nasujuro, whose icy killing intent seemed to make the air itself harden. "Damn it!" Aaron Keel swore. forcing his speed up another notch. The cliff of the red line was right in front of them. Just as the three of them launched themselves toward the edge, the three Gorosei hunting them made their move. St. Warcurry opened his enormous maw and with a bestial roar spewed a pressurized dragon of water at them. St. Mars unfurled his wings and a coil of pitch-black underworld flames spilled outward. At the same time, St. Nasuro drew the first-generation Kitetsu and unleashed a slash of ice that seemed to freeze the soul itself. Water, black fire, and that glacial blade, three utterly different forces, did not clash and repel as anyone might expect. Instead, they braided together, fused unnaturally, and erupted into a single monstrous dragon, massive, horned with ice, wreathed in black flames, and snapping toward the three of them. The dragon's destructive aura made every hair on Aaron Keel's arms bristle. "Monkey, Xiao Ying! It's on you too!" he barked. Mohawk shot him a look that plainly said, "Are you serious?" Both he and Aaron were hanging by a thread. A cold bead of sweat traveled down Monkey's temple. If he could have met that attack head-on, the flames of revolution would have already swept the world. Still, he didn't hesitate. He pivoted sharply, his right hand curling into a loose grip. Winds converged around him, sharpening into tens of thousands of slicing filaments that spun together into a green tornado. The whirlwind of razor wind met the ice-fire dragon head-on. The whirling wind-blade tornado hissed and tore at the air, only managing to thin the black flames and frost that crawled across the energy dragon's hide before it was ripped apart. There was no time. The three of them shared a quick, urgent look, and without hesitation leapt from the red line cliff, a sheer drop of thousands of meters. Weightlessness hit them, the wind screamed in their ears, and above, the dragon dove after them, right off the cliff, angling itself mid-air and chasing with relentless speed. Just as its destructive light was about to wash over them, something unexpected happened. The night sky beneath them thickened into a deeper, denser black than any they'd seen before. Pure, absolute darkness rose up without warning, as if the mouth of an abyss had opened. The ice and fire energy dragon plunged into that void and disappeared without a sound. Then, several thousand meters out over the sea, a colossal pillar of light stabbed toward the heavens and exploded. The blast drove a tidal wave a kilometer high into the air. The ocean had been violently blown into a gaping crater thousands of meters across. The water churned and stewed long after the blast. Aaron Keel peered into that familiar blackness below and laughed aloud. "Well done, Mariah." The wind screamed around them as Monkey summoned a gentle yet powerful updraft that cradled the three falling figures and bore them swiftly toward the distant horizon. At the lip of the red line cliff, the wind died to a low, keening whisper. The scalding steam slowly thinned, revealing the hulking silhouettes of three colossal figures cast against the clearing air. They stood motionless, staring into the bottomless void and the endless sea beyond it. St. Warcurry's chest heaved, 2 hot breaths lashed from his nostrils. St. Mars beat his ragged wings with a whooshing sound. In his sharp, bird-like eyes a fierce unwillingness burned. "Shall we give chase?" Mars asked, his voice hoarse and metallic, like gears grinding. "They're already at the end of their tether." He was about to spread his wings when St. Nasujiro at his side lifted a hand to halt him. One of the Gorosei, the one who had wielded a first-generation Kitetsu, had already reverted to human form. His once immaculate white priestly robes were streaked with dust and blood. He shook his head and stared off into the distance. "Do not press a cornered foe," he warned. St. Nasujiro's voice was calm but heavy with warning. "Aaron Keel has an endless supply of tricks. Drive them to desperation, and their final counterstrike could cost us dearly." They were not invincible. St. Warcurry fell silent, memories of the enemy surfacing, the golden-armored general, the blade of light that could sear mountains and boil seas, and that strange domain called silence. If they pressed on, even if they managed to kill their opponent, who could guarantee they wouldn't be dragged down with them? St. Mars offered no objection. The three supreme authorities of the world government stood on the cliff's edge and watched their foes withdraw at an unhurried pace, a humiliation they had never before endured. The air hung heavy and still. Then, from where sea met sky on the far horizon, an almost imperceptible whoosh whispered through the silence. The sound was almost lost in the howling wind off the cliff, too faint, too quick to register properly. What kind of beings were the Gorosei? Saint Nasujuro's brow tightened almost imperceptibly. Saint Warkari's beast-like eyes narrowed, and Saint Mars's avian head snapped up at once. A dark beam of light, haloed in black and red lightning, tore across thousands of meters of air with incomprehensible speed and struck the cliff in an instant. It was so fast they only managed to trace its trajectory. There was no time to mount any meaningful defense. The target was the largest of them all, Saint Warkari. A muffled puff. Saint Warkari's massive form shuddered, then went rigid. Saint Mars and Saint Nasujuro's gazes dropped to Warkari's enormous left tusk. A tiny, hardly noticeable hole had appeared there. Then, crack. A crisp, splintering sound rang out. From that small hole, a spiderweb of fissures raced across the tusk, and in the next heartbeat half of the enormous tusk, several meters long, snapped off and tumbled into the abyss. All things considered, the injury was minor. It was almost negligible. For a colossus like Saint Warkari, losing a tusk was no more than losing a tooth, but the insult was everything. He lowered his head slowly, staring at the jagged break, feeling a sharp, unmistakable pain radiate from the fracture. His huge frame trembled, not from fear, but from rage. A terrible fury, the kind that seemed capable of changing the color of sky and earth flared up inside him. Saint Nasujuro's face went completely dark. Saint Mars's enormous claws tightened without him thinking, crushing the rocks at his feet to dust. They didn't need to look to know the expression on that man's face several kilometers away. They could already picture the unrestrained, arrogant smile. That silent mockery cut deeper than any taunt. High overhead, 3 figures rode the wind, already shrinking into the distance. Aaron Keel broke his gaze, slid the antique silver pistol, its barrel etched with intricate patterns, back to his waist, and casually blew on the still warm muzzle. He laughed aloud, turning the pistol in his hand. Roger's sidearm, and, after Old Bay's demonic modifications, it's just a joy to use. Chapter 169, World Government Bulletin. World Government Bulletin. Recent reports claiming that the Gorosei fought pirates on the Red Line and that one of the Gorosei had been killed by pirates outside Mary Gioes have been investigated and found to be false. Mary Gioes is currently undergoing extensive renovation work, which has produced loud noises that were mistakenly interpreted as the sounds of battle. The person who died was not one of the Gorosei, but an outsourced construction worker on the Holy Land project who had legally changed his name to Gorosei. According to colleagues, he did so out of admiration for the Gorosei's lifelong dedication and selfless service to the nation and its people. The world government expresses deep sorrow for the death of this worker and extends its condolences to his family. At the same time, it condemns those who spread false rumors linking the Holy Land to pirate activity and thereby endangered public order. The world government reiterates that the Gorosei are the highest authorities of the government and the central force for maintaining world peace, prosperity, and stability. The recent claims that a Gorosei was killed by pirates are categorically untrue. We ask everyone not to believe or spread rumors, and to help create a favorable public opinion environment for the government's fight against pirates. World Government, Marine Calendar 1507. Ha ha ha! Hey, Xiao Ying, Ru, look, this is unbelievable! Puha! A sharp tang of disinfectant hung in the air of the villa on Sabaudi Archipelago. Kyle lay like a freshly unearthed mummy on the sofa, every inch of him wrapped in bandages. He clutched a newspaper and laughed so hard his whole body shook. A few of the recently healed wounds underneath the wrappings split open again, and dark red blood quickly seeped through. "Kyle!" came a cry. "Don't move!" Robin and Sakura lunged at him at the same instant. One grabbed his shoulders to steady him, while the other snatched the paper away, both movements driven by urgent irritation. "Your wounds! They've opened again!" Sakura's voice trembled as she tore through the medical kit for fresh gauze and ointment. Robin pressed a warm, damp towel to his forehead, wiping away the cold sweat slick from laughter and pain. Her eyes were a mixture of pity and scolding. "Ow, ow, ow! Easy, Sakura-chan." Kyle winced, but he couldn't stop laughing. Mihawk walked over without expression, took the newspaper from the visibly flustered Sakura, and scanned it with those hawk-like eyes. Rue leaned in beside him and read the headline, World Government Bulletin. Beneath the official heading was a carefully worded statement, meticulous in language, ridiculous in content. Rue's pupils narrowed. He ignored the flowery, whitewashing officialese and pulled out the one brutal fact buried between the lines. One of the Gorosei was dead. His gaze slid from the paper to the man still squabbling with Sakura and Robin. The man collapsed on the sofa like a spent rag, yelping as his wounds were being tended. That man had single-handedly taken on 4 of the world government's highest authorities on the Red Line and killed one of them. This wasn't a mere battle report. It was the stuff of myth. An earth-shattering claim that could upend the world's understanding and send shockwaves through every sea. Even Rue, a man who had long since put thoughts of life and death behind him, felt a shock that ran through him. He had always rated Kyle highly, even seeing him as a decisive factor who could alter the balance of the world. But now it looked as if everything he had witnessed so far might only be the tip of the iceberg. And at that very moment, the god who had inspired those legends was reduced to something almost pathetic. "Just one sip, Robin," he pleaded in a small voice. "I swear I'll only take 1 sip of orange juice for disinfection." "Shut up!" Robin's tone was cold as she pressed the ointment on harder. "Ow!" Rue's attention wandered to another section of the newspaper. The headline read, Hawkeye, Dracula Mihawk crowned, declared world's strongest swordsman. The article itself was short and vague, only noting that Mihawk had fought a peak-level duel on the Red Line against an unidentified legendary swordsman and had ultimately prevailed. Coupled with Mihawk's long-running reputation for seeking out and challenging the most powerful figures across the 4 seas, Morgans, president of the World Economic Journal, had officially begun to drum up support for his coronation. Rue's eyes flickered as he glanced at the statue-like figure of Mihawk beside him. The man had just been reading aloud about the so-called legend, Saint Nasujuro, one of the Gorosei, wielding a first-generation ketsu. A faint surprise crossed Mihawk's face for a heartbeat, then smoothed back into his usual calm. World's strongest, Mihawk thought. He remembered Nasujuro's cold expression and the soul-freezing bite of that ancient blade. He had pushed himself to his limit, unleashed the restraints on Yoru, and still only managed to match the man, to reach a stalemate in pure swordsmanship. Having seen the true summit of this sea, the world's empty epithets no longer stirred him. The path of the sword had no end. "How about it, Mr. World's Strongest Swordsman? Any thoughts?" Kyle teased. That pompous bird Morgans really outdid himself this time, poking around and spinning such a tale. Boring. Mihawk tossed the newspaper onto the table with a casual flick, his answer sharp and spare. The others couldn't help but grin. The stoic swordsman's brusque dismissal felt almost like delight. For a moment, the villa fell into a brief, comfortable silence. Kyle's smile fell as he looked toward the corner and saw someone completely unscathed. Jekko Mariah sat in a single armchair, legs crossed, leaning back with a glass of crimson liquid in hand. Not a speck of dust clung to him, a sharp contrast to the bedraggled state of Kyle and Mihawk. "Mariah, did you take care of everything?" Kyle asked. "Nee-hee-hee." Mariah chuckled that eerie laugh of his and drained the glass. "Of course. Most of those idiotic pigs and Mary Joys who call themselves gods now have a nice little something tucked away in their hearts." He made a slow, deliberate motion with his hand, closing his fingers as if gripping an invisible, beating heart. "When the time is right." "As you ordered, those 2 have been brought back," he continued. "Stella was sent to the East Blue by the Shadow Guard and handed over to Ms. Rouge. As for that little girl from Amazon Lily," he nodded toward an upstairs room. "She's up there, very well behaved." Mariah said it offhand, then let his eyes travel over the bandages wrapped around Kyle's body and the deep, bone-deep sword cut marring Mihawk's chest. A shiver ran through him. His voice carried a genuine, almost embarrassed relief. "I was a little sorry I didn't get to face the Gorosei myself, but it looks like I made the right call." "Gee." Kyle nodded, pleased. The Stella card couldn't be played yet, not until the right pieces were in place. He would wait for Guild Tesoro, the man consumed by hunger and hatred, to forge his golden empire with his own hands. At Tesoro's moment of greatest triumph, his supposedly dead white moonlight would return. That single favor, powerful enough to overturn an entire world, would be all it took to bind him to Kyle's cause. And Boa Hancock, Kyle's mouth twisted into a small, satisfied smirk at the image of the proud, stubborn young girl. That, he admitted to himself, was a small personal indulgence. The future pirate empress would need careful grooming from youth. He frowned, suddenly uneasy. He replayed the whole Mary Geoise operation in his mind, searching for the detail he was sure he'd forgotten. Names and fragments tumbled through Kyle's head. Tiger, Ginny, Kuma, Ru, Xiao Ying, slave liberation, the Gorosei, Mariah's mission. Wait! Damn it! Doflamingo! Kyle's expression froze. He'd left Doflamingo to burn in Mary Geoise and hadn't given him another thought. Hen, almost as quickly, he relaxed. With that man's guile and power, self-preservation shouldn't be a problem. He'd know how to get out of the Holy Land. Right? 170. I am Dothodo Fufufuf. Who am I? I am Don Quixote do Flamingo. Once I was a god, a celestial dragon walking among men. That world was my playground. The red line beneath my feet was sacred ground, and the people on the blue sea below were nothing but talking livestock. Their lives, their dignity, their wealth, everything was a toy for my amusement. I looked down on them like dirty ants. Their cries and pleas were the sweetest soundtrack of my childhood. Father. That hopeless, foolish man, Saint Homing Don Quixote. He renounced his godhood, took my mother Rosie and me, and obsessed with some ridiculous idea of humans, descended from that sacred place in the clouds. He personally shoved us out of heaven and into the most defiled hell. Gods became men. No, worse, we became fallen gods, perfect targets for the commoner's fury. Hung on the walls, my skin seared by flames, I remember. Arrows driving into my flesh, the hot rush of blood, I remember. They spat at me, they pelted me with stones. They sneered and shouted the same thing over and over until it became a chorus in my ears. Weakness is the original sin. My mother died of illness. Rosie, idiot that she was, could do nothing but cry. Only I, crushed under that endless pain and humiliation, woke the Haoshoku inside me. In that moment I understood. It wasn't me who was wrong. The world was. It was my father who dragged me down into hell. So I killed him. I carried his head, expecting that would be enough to take back what I had lost and to return to Mary Geoise. Instead, those so-called compatriots looked at me as if I were filth. They feared me. They rejected me. They called me an aberration, a stain on the god's bloodline. Then it became clear there was no going back to heaven, and I had no use for hell. If the world would not accept me, I would overturn it myself. Fu-fu-fu-fu-fu. I founded the Don Quixote family. Treble, Diamante, Virgo, Pica, monsters the world had discarded, found a place with me. They hailed me as their king and pledged everything to my ambition. Step by step, I climbed higher. I pulled strings, used violence, and played one nation against another. I toyed with powerful men and women until they did my bidding. I became Joker, the emperor of the underworld. I thought I'd climbed as high as anyone could. Then Aaron Keel showed up. The first time I saw him, I wrote him off as a dangerous lunatic. Strong, unnervingly strong, but strength alone is common enough on this boundless sea. He was someone I could use, cooperate with, or, if the moment demanded it, stab in the back. That was the rule I lived by. But Aaron did something I didn't understand. He tore through every mask I'd ever worn. He made my grand designs look like a child's scribble. Before I knew it, he had hitched me to his chariot and driven off with me in tow. I became his subordinate. Humiliating? Of course. I am Ten Yasha, born to be a king. How could I, of all people, bow to anyone? I endured, biding my time, always searching for a weak thread I could pull to cut his hold on me. Then he told me where he was headed. Mary Geoise, the place I both loathed and craved. He was going there to make trouble. At that moment, my heart nearly stopped. Shock? Ecstasy? I couldn't tell which. No words could do it justice. It wasn't just anger. It was a fire that started deep in my bones, a hunger to destroy everything. He was about to do what I had always wanted to do, but never dared. When towering flames finally ate through the Holy Land, when I watched the celestial dragons, those people who normally lorded it over everyone, scatter like pigs and dogs, when I turned their own guards against one another and listened to the screams and wails. Foo-foo-foo-foo, foo-foo-foo-foo. A thrill unlike anything I'd ever known surged through me. This was what I had wanted. This was the scene I had dreamed of. I thought that was the limit of what Keel could give me. A magnificent revenge, the humiliation of the world government. Then I saw them, the Gorosei, 5 beings at the summit of power, monsters who had looked down on all life like gods for 800 years. When they descended in those inhuman forms, something stirred, a terror rooted in my bloodline, a despair that felt like being crushed at the most fundamental level of my existence. Their presence alone made my soul tremble. My pride, strength, ambitions, and schemes were as fragile as paper in their presence. I understood then. This was the world's true face. Everything I had done before was a pompous clown show on a chessboard laid out by gods. I despaired. That wall was one I could never cross. Keel was doomed. No one could stand against those monsters, not one, much less 5. And yet, what did I see? Keel smiled. Facing the Gorosei, his grin was even more arrogant and unrestrained than anything I had ever worn. He launched himself into the fray. Beams of light, lightning, and searing slashes tore the air. Alone, he fought 4 of the Gorosei at once. This was no mere battle. It was the reappearance of a myth, a collision of natural disasters. The red line cracked beneath them. The sky shifted its color under their power. I watched, disbelieving. The Satan Saint's pincer-like leg was severed and then blinked back into being. St. Peter's vast, worm-like sand body was yanked from the earth and sliced clean in 2. St. Mars's black flames were struck down by a falling meteor. St. Warcury's full-on charge was met and stopped headlong. My mind went blank. Every perception I'd ever trusted, every piece of so-called common sense was shattered and pulverized in that instant. It dawned on me in that instant, gods could be hurt. Gods could be challenged. Keel wasn't immortal. He was a demon king, a being above even the gods. When that dark domain unfurled and swallowed every scrap of light and sound silence, I stopped breathing. In that absolute void, time and space lost all meaning. The 4 Gorosei, those invincible monsters, hung motionless like insects trapped in amber. Then Keel struck. 1 slash. 2, 3, 4. The domain shattered and blood spouted from the bodies of the 4 gods. I saw pain twist their faces, heard their muffled groans. Gods, bleeding gods. The sight hit me harder than the sea of fire in Mary Geoise, harder than the wails of the celestial dragons. I trembled with a kind of ecstasy. Finally, that black and gold dragon-shaped slash, rending heaven and earth, met the Gorosei's combined assault. The world seemed to stop beneath that single impact. For a breathless second, I thought he was gone. No one should survive a torrent like that. He stepped out of the smoke and dust, and his golden eyes burned with a mad fighting spirit that could have set the whole world on fire. He had won. No, he hadn't even treated it like a life-or-death struggle. He was playing. He treated a deadly clash with the world's highest authority like an intoxicating game. And then I understood, completely understood. A throne I'd chased my whole life looked laughable beside him. King? Ha! What pirate king, what emperor of the underworld. In front of this man, all those titles were empty. Follow him. Only by following him could I see farther horizons. Only by following him could I turn this rotten world upside down. Only by following him could I truly destroy everything. My strings, once the source of my pride and my means of controlling the world, I placed willingly into his hand. The thickest, toughest string. Let him tug it. Let him pull me. Let him steer me. I am Don Quixote do Flamingo. I am Tenyasha. I am Joker. From this day on, I am also Aaron Keel's most loyal and most deranged hound. Foo 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 foo. Tremble world, the true storm has only just begun. 171. After the incident. The tidal wave of consequences unleashed by the battle at Mary Geoise inexplicably died down after the world government issued that absurd announcement. At first, most people assumed it was the work of some bold satirist, an obvious joke. Bushquam, are you making fools of us? They laughed. How could a pirate even think of attacking Mary Geoise? My God, the funniest thing to hit the Grand Line in years. The feared Buster Call never descended on Sabari, and the frantic retaliations everyone expected never came. There were, here and there, purges in the underworld, but Karen's prior arrangements had staved off disaster. Peripheral channels were sacrificed, but the core networks remained intact. On the surface, everything appeared calm, as if the brutal clash that shook the Red Line had never occurred. Inside a villa on the Sabati archipelago, Kyle peeled off the last of his bandages, stretched until his joints popped, and flopped back onto the sofa. He stared out at the flat, glassy sea and sighed. Boring, he muttered. He hadn't even managed to see little Emu this time. Another miscalculation, another missed chance. I thought those 5, no 4, old geezers would be furious enough to remotely use the ancient weapons and level my place, he muttered. But that's it. All bark and no bite. Maybe they think a public, large-scale attack on you would be tantamount to admitting their crushing defeat at Mary Geoa's, Robin said, setting a cup of black tea on the table and pushing it toward him. That would be a self-incriminating display of weakness. It would seriously damage the world government's prestige. Kyle huffed in annoyance. Of course he understood the logic. The Gorosei could not afford to lose face. Admitting that a pirate had struck the Holy Land was a humiliation they'd rather swallow than announce. Better to pretend nothing happened and plan revenge in secret than to answer with an obvious public strike. He scowled at the thought. At that moment, the shadows in the corner of the room twisted, and a tall, lanky silhouette stepped forward, Gecko Mariah. Close behind him moved another figure, taller still, draped in a pink feather coat that rustled softly as he walked. When the newcomer turned, the face that showed was unmistakable, Don Quixote do Flamingo. Gone was his usual foo-foo-foo cackle and the insolent air that never took anything seriously. He walked quietly to Kyle, and under the slightly surprised looks from Robin and Mariah, slowly dropped to one knee. For a man who had once counted among the 10 Yasha, that gesture was more degrading than death. Yet there was no sign of coercion or bitterness in his posture, only genuine reverence and complete submission, as if it sprang from the very bottom of his soul. Lord Kyle. His voice was hoarse but astonishingly clear. Kyle barely opened his eyes. He picked up a cup of black tea, blew on it, and said casually, "Hey, Doffy, made it back in one piece? I half thought some celestial dragon had roasted you like a turkey." Doflamingo's body trembled, but he kept his gaze lowered. "Because of you, I survived." He knew, of course he knew, that Kyle had left him behind on purpose. A test and a warning. He had passed it. Kyle took a sip of tea and asked, "So, how was the scenery in the Holy Land?" For the first time since he had arrived, Doflamingo's voice trembled with a barely contained excitement. "Yes, that was the most beautiful sight I've ever seen. Gods bleeding, celestial dragons wailing. What to him looked like a hellscape was, paradoxically, the gospel of heaven." Kyle set his teacup down and finally fixed a proper look on him. "Get up. Why are you kneeling?" "Yes." Don Quixote Doflamingo rose, but stayed bowed, unwilling to meet Kyle's gaze. Those golden pupils, burning with a ferocious, almost insane fighting spirit that seemed to pierce past the red line, had been seared into his memory. "Go back. Everything as usual." Kyle waved a hand. "Keep being a Shichibukai. Keep being my Joker." Doflamingo froze and, as if by reflex, lifted his eyes. "Lord Kyle, What, you want to stay here and serve tea?" Kyle arched an eyebrow. "I don't need more servants. I gave you power for a reason, not to make you my errand boy. I don't micromanage. Consider this me granting you broad freedom so your initiative can be fully exercised. Understood?" Those casually magnanimous words hit Doflamingo like divine decree. This was trust and acknowledgement of his abilities from that devilish man. "I understand," Don Quixote Doflamingo answered, nodding hard as the familiar fire of ambition flickered back to life in his eyes. Only now the heart of that fire bore Kyle's mark. "I will never disappoint you." He bowed deeply, then turned, and without hesitation, followed Mariah back into the shadows. Kyle watched him go and let out a short chuckle. Doflamingo was far more useful loose and dangerous. Keeping him tethered would only make him a liability. Thump, 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 deliberately heavy footsteps came down the stairs. Kyle glanced up to see a tall girl with glossy black hair descending, a stack of documents clutched to her chest, her lips in a stubborn pout. It was Boa Hancock, who had been invited back by Mariah. At 16, she was already coming into her elegance. Her beautiful face wore that familiar blend of haughty pride and thinly veiled displeasure. She couldn't strike out at Kyle, so she protested the only way she dared. Hancock stomped to the table and slammed the papers down with a dull thud. "Your things," she said coldly, though a faint tremor at the edge of her voice betrayed her irritation. In the few days since she'd arrived, Hancock had already seen enough to be unnerved. The aloof man, called the world's greatest swordsman, still wore bandages across his chest, supposedly wounds from a duel with the world's top swordsman on the Red Line. The other man, who behaved as if nothing could trouble him, had reportedly taken on 4 gods alone and come back in one piece. The stories about them felt like living terror. Hancock had no intention of openly opposing them. She knew better than to pick a fight, but she also refused to give in. Learning that Robin, Sakura, and Rin, girls her own age, had all been taken by this man in one way or another only made her angrier. A shared resentment burned in her chest. "You worked hard, little Hancock," Kyle said, lifting a stack of documents without so much as glancing in her direction. Hancock bit her lower lip. Being ignored only made her mood worse. She watched Robin quietly refill Kyle's black tea and saw Sakura methodically sorting a medical kit nearby. Both of them moved as if this was perfectly normal, and their calm acceptance dug at her pride. She was about to turn and stalk away when a hand shot out in a flash. A sharp flick snapped across her forehead. Thwack! The sting brought a surprised cry from her lips as she clutched her brow. She glared at Kyle, partly shocked, mostly furious, but he only smiled at her, the kind of patient expression you give an unreasonable little sister. "Must you walk like that, trying to stamp through the floor?" "You." Hancock trembled with anger, but found herself tongue-tied. With an exasperated stomp, she clutched her head and raced upstairs. "What a troublesome kid," Kyle muttered, shaking his head as he opened the documents in his hands. Most of them were industry reports and intelligence summaries submitted by Karen. He skimmed through them quickly. Then he noticed an envelope that gave off a faint floral scent. It was from Rouge. He tore it open and saw Rouge's neat, elegant handwriting on the letter paper. 172. The corpse is warm. Keel unfolded the letter and read Rouge's neat, familiar handwriting aloud to himself. "Greetings. While you've been away, everything in East Blue has been as usual. That boy Ace is getting stronger, but he's wild. Every few days he bolts up into the mountains with that little rascal Sabo. He always comes back covered in cuts and bruises, and Miss Dodon has a terrible time keeping him in line. A few days ago he dragged home a huge tiger, saying it was for dinner, and nearly tore Dodan's house down. Boys are hard to manage once they grow. The girl you wanted me to look after, Stella, has settled in. She was very frightened at first, but after I explained things, she understood your intentions. She's a kind child and now helps at the flower shop every day. Very skilled with her hands and careful with the beds. She often stares out to sea. I think she's waiting for the day she can be reunited with Mr. Tesoro. Be careful out there. Rouge." At the bottom of the page, someone had doodled a crooked smiley face in pencil, and next to it, in the same wobbly script, were 2 more crooked letters. Ace. Keel let a small, soft smile touch his face. Ace. Sabo. With the future Luffy involved, and those 3 brats together, Mount Corvo would probably never know peace. As for Stella, Keel folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope. "Tesoro, use your gold to pave the brightest path for Moonlight's return." After several months of uneventful life on the Sabaody archipelago, Keel felt himself getting rusty. He left the day-to-day trivialities to Robin, then slipped quietly away from the villa. His destination was Baltigo, the White Dirt Island, the Revolutionary Army's headquarters. The moment Keel set foot on that pale soil, the whole base went to maximum alert. Patrolling revolutionary soldiers, weapons at the ready, closed in around him. The tension in the air was so thick it could be wrung out. "Wave-guiding king, Aaron Keel," someone called, voice trembling. Only a handful of cadres, thanks to top-secret intelligence, knew the truth. This was the monster who had stood toe-to-toe with 5 gods at Mary Geoy's, a living legend, a force capable of toppling their stronghold. Fear rippled through the ranks. Then a gust of wind swept the square, and Dragon's figure appeared, stepping out before them all. "Everyone, step back," Dragon said, his voice calm but unmistakably commanding. "He's a guest." No sooner had the words left his mouth than an even larger-than-usual figure barreled out from deep within the base, accompanied by a trademark Viha. Ivankov's enormous face filled Keel's field of vision, and without ceremony, he grabbed Keel's arm. "Keel, you're finally here. I thought you'd be rotting away in someone's warm embrace." The revolutionary officers standing nearby stared, mouths hanging open. Lord Ivankov, daring to lay hands on that man? Ugh, get off me. Keel shrugged Ivankov's hand away with an irritated flick. Don't smother me with your hormones. He swept a casual look over the still tense cadres and addressed Dragon with a grin. No need for the big show. All that ceremony is useless, haha. Dragon returned the smile and stepped aside to reveal a tall, silent figure standing behind him, Bartholomew Kuma. Kuma stepped forward and bowed deeply, awkward but sincere. Mr. Keel, thank you for saving Ginny. The exchange and that simple explanation left the revolutionary officers completely bewildered. Among the guests were some of the revolutionaries' most recognizable faces. Ivankov, one of Dragon's spiritual mentors and the man who had once saved Kuma, and even a legendary pirate whose lazy, easygoing manner belied how deep his ties ran with the core leadership. With so many familiar allies present, the tension that had filled the cavern slowly eased. Keel's reason for coming was simple: to attend Kuma and Ginny's wedding. The ceremony had been arranged in a wide underground cave in Baltigo. There were no lavish trappings, just streamers and paper flowers hung by comrades' hands, yet the plainness only made the celebration feel more sincere. Laughter and music filled the stone chamber. The joy here was quieter but far more real than any ostentatious banquet. Before the ceremony began, Kuma stood apart in a shadowed corner, his broad back turned to the party as if unsure what to do with himself. Keel found him, carrying a glass of wine, and leaned against the rock nearby. "Come on," he said lightly. "Groom trying to make a run for it at the last minute?" Kuma turned. Worry sat plain on his face. "Mr. Keel," he said quietly, "you know my bloodline. The Buccaneer blood is cursed. I'm afraid I'll bring disaster to Ginny." Keel took a slow sip of wine and set the glass down. "So what?" he said. "You're going to throw away the happiness you have now because you might be afraid of something that hasn't happened yet?" Kuma's body trembled at the words, caught between fear and the life waiting for him inside the cave. "The events at Mary Gioa's showed you hiding is pointless," Keel said quietly. "If you can't hide, then protect her. Protect her with your life. If you don't have that kind of resolve, that would be the truest betrayal of her." Kuma stood silent for a long moment, clutching the small Bible he always carried. Confusion and fear flickered across his face, then slowly gave way to a hard, steady determination. He gave a heavy, deliberate nod. "I understand." The ceremony itself was presided over by Dragon. Ginny, all light and warmth, wore a simple white dress. Her smile outshone the lamps set into the cave ceiling. She reached for Kuma's large, clumsy hand without hesitation and met the eyes of everyone present. With Ginny leading him, the shy Kuma, nervous, palms sweating, straightened until he stood as rigid as a post. "Bartholomew Kuma, do you take Ginny as your wife? Will you protect her, cherish her, through storm and calm, in battle and in peace, for the rest of your life?" Dragon asked. Kuma drew in a long breath, his voice low but razor clear. "I do." "Ginny, do you take Bartholomew Kuma as your husband, to stand by him through whatever past he carries, whatever future he faces, never leaving his side?" the officiant asked. "Of course I do," Ginny answered, crisp and unwavering. Cheers and whistles rose from their Revolutionary Army comrades. Kuma awkwardly bent down and kissed his bride. The cave erupted in thunderous applause. Keel lingered at the edge of the crowd, watching the two who had suffered so much finally come together. His feelings were tangled. He thought of the frightened boy at God Valley who had cried out and confronted the Satan Saint, the gentle pastor in the Sorbet Kingdom, and the future tyrant who would one day lose himself and become a weapon. What a pity. I couldn't kill Satan, he thought. Perhaps that's something Kuma will have to finish. Because of what he'd done, the current of fate had shifted. Standing there, the middle-aged old man wore a conflicted smile. How strange, he mused wryly. The corpse is still warm. Chapter 173, Furnace. The joy and clamor of a wedding eventually fade into memory. 2 years had passed since the farewell at Baltigo. For Aaron Keel, who had only recently transmigrated, those years had been the most leisurely and the most boring of his life. The massive shockwaves from the battle at Mary Gioa's had, unexpectedly, died down after the world government issued a transparently phony statement. There was no buster call, no frenzied reprisals, and not even a noticeable increase in marine patrols around Sabadi. It was as if the world had been made to forget that night. Under Aaron's direction and Karen's careful maneuvering, the global underworld slid into a quiet dormancy. The criminal networks lay low like great beasts sunk to the ocean floor, withdrawing their claws and waiting in silence for the next order to rise and stir the seas again. The Grand Line itself remained lively. Rookie crews poured into it like schools of migrating fish, each chasing their own dream. None of it touched the Sabaudi archipelago, though. Sabaudi sat at the end of the first half of the Grand Line, the only gateway to the New World, and for now it was simply biding its time. Every day, a steady stream of pirate ships came in to dock, refuel, and resupply. Yet oddly, this once chaotic, lawless place had become the calmest harbor along the entire route. An unwritten rule had taken root in the hearts of every pirate who set foot on the island. On the Sabaudi archipelago, no one drew a sword without good reason. The reason was simple. The island belonged to one man, Aaron Keel, the wave-guiding king. Nobody wanted to test whether causing trouble here would catch his notice. Ending up as fertilizer for the Urukiman mangrove was not a fate anyone was eager to brag about. Outside a tavern in Area 24, a newly minted captain from the North Blue, his bounty already at 30 million berries, was shouting at a burly man with a scarred face. "You bastard! Keep staring at me one more time, and I'll gouge your eyes out," he snarled. The scarred man only grinned, flashing a mouthful of gold teeth, his right hand inching toward the axe at his hip. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. For a heartbeat, the tavern hung in perfect, nervous stillness, the air thick with the promise of violence. Bang! The tavern door slammed open. A man in a black suit and dark sunglasses strode in. He didn't even glance at the two captains poised to fight. He went straight to the bar and dropped a gold coin onto the counter. "Boss, 2 rums. Send them to the west side, entrance 3 of the forge," he said. Then he slowly turned. From behind his shades, his gaze swept over the 2 pirate captains. "Want to fight?" His voice was flat, but it cut through the room like a chill wind. The temperature in the tavern seemed to drop a few degrees. Sabaudi welcomes the brave and the strong, not brainless fools. The younger captain's face went from flushed to ashen. He'd heard the rules, everyone on Sabaudi had, but youth and hot blood made rules feel like challenges. If you want to prove who's stronger, go to the forge." The man pointed toward the center of the island. "There are plenty of arenas there where you can settle things to the death. Win, and you not only take the other's head, but also a hefty share of the ticket money. And if you're lucky—" He paused, a slow, suggestive smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "You might even be noticed by Lord Aaron Keel or Lord Karen and rise to prominence overnight." Those words hit the newly appointed captain like a bucket of cold water, instantly snuffing out his fire. Rise to prominence overnight, 4 small words that were poison to any pirate with ambition. He flicked a hard look at the gold-toothed enforcer across the room. The hostile glare in the man's eyes shifted, hardening into a hungry eagerness for a fight. "Fine," the gold-toothed man said, drawing his hand back. "I'll twist off your worthless head in the forge." With that, he strode out of the tavern. The new Tane snorted and followed. A potentially bloody street brawl had been diffused as if by steam, and the other patrons, used to scenes like this, simply went back to drinking and bragging as though nothing had happened. This was the Sabaudi archipelago now. The forge they spoke of was Lord Karen's pride from the last 2 years, a vast coliseum planted in the heart of the islands, able to hold 100,000 spectators. Since private duels were forbidden on the island, Karen had provided an official, sanctioned, and highly profitable arena for combat. It was straightforward business logic: regulate the bloodshed and profit from it. At the forge you had 2 choices: apply for a regular duel, a fight meant to settle disputes without causing permanent harm, or sign a death pact and enter a bloody death match, where the contest ended only when one fighter fell. Tickets were sold for every bout, and the victor walked away with 20% of the gate as prize money. Blood, violence, cash, and the chance to rise. Those elements made the Forge Sabaudi's most infamous attraction. Pirates, bounty hunters, and thrill-seekers packed the stands for fist-to-flesh spectacles. More than anything, though, people came for the rumor that the island's owner, the wave-guiding king Aaron Keel, sometimes took the top-floor VIP box to watch. A single nod or glance from him could change a desperate person's life, and winning his attention became the deepest hunger of every struggler scraping by on the island. On the highest floor of the forge, in a plush VIP box with an unobstructed view, Aaron Keel lounged on a soft sofa, boots casually propped on the low table. He idly picked at a skewer of freshly grilled takoyaki as his gaze wandered down to the massive circular arena, where two devil fruit users tore into each other with brutal intensity. A man whose body could sprout bone spikes chased desperately after an opponent who stretched and flopped like warm dough. Spikes jabbed through the air, elastic limbs flailed, the whole scene looked more slapstick than deadly. Aaron Keel snorted and flicked a spent bamboo skewer. It sailed across the room and dropped neatly into a trash can. Karen. Yes, Lord Aaron Keel. Standing just behind him, Karen, hair perfectly combed, suit immaculate, bowed slightly. He held an electronic tablet crammed with figures. His voice was flat, as if reciting the weather. This quarter, combined revenue from forged tickets, merchandise, and paid online broadcasts, after operating costs and personnel expenses, produced a net profit of 2.7 billion berries, an 8% increase from last quarter. Aaron picked up another takoyaki skewer and chewed thoughtfully. Huh? That bone spike fellow's interesting. Make a note of him for observation, Aaron said. Karen, expression unreadable, tapped his stylus against the tablet and wrote, Understood. A message just came in from Lord Doflamingo, another attendant added. He's taken an interest in the winner of last week's death match, the swordsman called Ghost Slash, and wants him transferred to Dressrosa as a gladiator in the arena. Let him handle it, Aaron waved a hand dismissively. You don't need to bother me with every minor matter. Yes, sir. Below them, the fight was reaching its climax. The bone-spiked fighter seized a single opening. In an instant, every spike along his body erupted, pinning the dough-like opponent to the wall, and he finished the match with a brutal headbutt. The crowd exploded in approval. Blood covered the victor, but he barely seemed to notice. Instead, he looked up with all his strength toward the legendary top-floor VIP box, his eyes bright with longing and expectation. Aaron Keel, seated in that box, didn't so much as raise an eyelid. He merely glanced at Karen, who stood respectfully at his side, and then, without any outward sign of excitement, smiled. You've turned brutal pirate brawls into a grand commercial spectacle. You've taken the jungle law, the strong devour the weak, and made it a perpetually profitable inbred industry. You even came up with pay-per-view live streams and cross-border underground betting, so the world's rich can throw fortunes at Sabaodi's gladiators. Aaron Keel sat up and gave Karen a firm pat on the shoulder. Karen, you're a damn genius. The praise was genuine. Aaron prided himself on being a hands-off boss, but Karen had a talent for taking offhand ideas and building them into a vast, precise, and astonishingly lucrative empire. Professional matters, Aaron thought, should be left to professionals. Karen stiffened for a moment, then bowed deeply. For the first time, there was a faint quiver in his voice. It is my honor to share your burdens. All right, stop with that. Aaron waved a hand and let himself slump back into the sofa, stretching with a big yawn. He stared out the window at the unchanged blue sky and drifting clouds and let out a long, satisfied sigh. Ah, so boring, he muttered. Is nothing big going to happen? Are those old geezers in the world government really just cultivating themselves and planning to retire together? 2 years of peace had nearly made him forget the taste of battle. He felt like every part of him was starting to rust. He needed something. Danger, excitement, anything to break the monotony. Lucky for him, this world rarely let his expectations go unfulfilled for long. Chapter 174, Empress of Nine Snakes. Aaron Keel's bored sigh echoed through the private room. Karen stood to the side with his head bowed, eyes lowered, long used to his boss's sporadic, often groundless complaints. For a moment, there was nothing but the murmur of the crowd drifting up from the arena below. The door opened quietly. A tall, radiant figure stepped in, carrying a plate of sliced fruit. Boa Hancock, more stunning than before. She set the plate gently on the table beside Aaron Keel, her movements delicate and measured, entirely unlike the headstrong girl from 2 years ago who used to stride in boldly and speak her mind without reserve. Aaron Keel-sama, please have some fruit, she said in a sweet, soft voice. When her gaze fell on Aaron's profile, something bright and involuntary lit in her eyes. Aaron grunted, casually speared a piece of apple, and kept his attention fixed on the arena where two new contestants were preparing for the next death match. Hancock did not move away. She stood there, rooted, looking at him with open admiration. To her, he was a living legend. After 2 years of constant companionship, and after piecing together the fragments of the Battle of Mary Geoise through indirect questions, she had assembled a complete and terrifying picture in her mind. He had single-handedly fought 4 Gorosei, shattered the Red Line, and still returned alive to recover from his wounds. His strength had long since exceeded anything Hancock could fathom. Yet in everyday life he kept up an almost lazy, easygoing facade, witty, casually humorous, telling jokes she didn't always understand, but that made her laugh all the same. That stark contrast held a kind of dangerous appeal for a young woman feeling the first stirrings of love. More generally, a mature, steady, wealthy, and powerful bachelor like Aaron Keel carried an almost lethal allure for girls. In the past, she'd secretly egged Robin and Sakura on, trying to get them to band together and resist the charms of this devil. But now, watching Robin calmly sort his documents and seeing Sakura and Suzune fuss over refreshments for him, her feeling had changed. It was no longer shared scorn. It was a sharp, personal sense of crisis. These overly familiar, sisterly friends are getting far too close to Aaron Keel. Hancock couldn't help but brood over the thought as Robin stepped into the room with a new report. "Aaron Keel, this is the latest intelligence from the New World," Robin said, handing him the document. She took his empty teacup as smoothly as she gave the paper back, a single fluid motion that spoke of practiced efficiency. Hancock watched the exchange, unconsciously biting her lower lip. A few days after Hancock had been brought to Sabaody, the villa had received 2 notable visitors, Pluton, Silver's Rayleigh, and his old flame, Shaki. Rayleigh sat back in a chair, watching Aaron Keel sprawled on a beach lounger, and took a long swig of sake. "You lucky brat," he chuckled, shaking his head. "You certainly live a leisurely life." Shaki, cigarette poised between her fingers, followed Rayleigh's gaze to the garden, where Hancock, water can in hand, tended the flowers, Sakura and Suzune working nearby. She blew a smoke ring and smiled. "Is that the girl from Amazon Lily?" she asked. "She's very beautiful." Rayleigh set his bottle down, his expression turning just a little serious. "Aaron, you bringing her out like this, the Kuja won't let it slide. Gloriosa won't be pleased, will she?" Aaron Keel opened one eye and glanced over at Rayleigh. "Shaki-san didn't object," Rayleigh protested. "So why are you, an outsider, making such a fuss?" Shaki only laughed at him. "I haven't been Empress for a long time," she said lightly. "And honestly, it's better for her to be with you than stuck on that little island." Aaron Keel's answer left Rayleigh momentarily speechless. Shaki had once been an Empress of Amazon Lily. She had every right to speak on the matter. Aaron leaned back, closing his eyes in that lazy way of his. "Besides," he added, "if she really comes looking for trouble, I have my own methods." Rayleigh's unease didn't have to wait long to be realized. Half a month later, a ship flying the Kuja emblem pulled into the Sabaody port. An old woman, leaning on a snake-shaped staff, stormed into the villa like a thunderclap. It was Gloriosa, the former Empress of Amazon Lily, the woman later nicknamed Nyan Ba. Age had reduced her frame, but the sharp sweep of her brows still hinted at the fierce beauty she'd possessed in the days of the Rock's pirates. She slammed her staff into the floor with a series of heavy thuds. "Air! On keel!" she roared, voice cracking with fury. "You upstart! How dare you abduct my Kuja sister? Hand over Hancock at once." Aaron Keel, who had been reading the paper in the living room, glanced up at the furious woman and gave no sign of surprise. Gloriosa planted her hands on her hips, chin tipped up, radiating indignation. "Aaron Keel! I don't care if you're the wave-guiding king or some kind of monster. Today I will teach you a lesson for Roger, this disrespectful." She struck a fighting pose, genuinely ready to attack. Aaron folded the newspaper and rose slowly, unhurried. He gave off no haki, made no threatening move. He simply looked at her, calm and cold, and said something no one in the room expected. "Roger never loved you." He had aimed for her weakest point, and the blow landed perfectly. The words hit Gloriosa like a bolt from the blue. Her body went rigid, The fury on her face froze and in an instant was replaced by raw shock and a sorrow so deep it swallowed everything else. Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. That single sentence had struck the secret she had guarded most fiercely, the wound she had carried her whole life, and for a long, unbearable moment she was unable to respond. Wah! Something in Gloriosa finally snapped. Decades of suppressed grievance and resentment exploded in an instant. She flung aside her serpent-topped staff, buried her face in her hands, and released a raw, heart-wrenching wail before turning and storming out of the villa. The proud bearing of the legendary Empress vanished with her retreating back. Hancock stood frozen. Robin, Sakura, and Suzune exchanged baffled looks. No one knew what to say. It was as if Gloriosa had been cut down by her own words. After that outburst, she left and was never seen again. A year passed. Hancock turned 18 and had grown from an innocent girl into a woman of breathtaking beauty. That evening, she went to Aaron Keel without hesitation. Aaron was reading in his study when she appeared. He looked up at her words and paused. "Is it uncomfortable living here?" he asked. "No." Hancock shook her head and stepped closer, summoning the courage to meet his eyes. "It's very good here," she admitted, "but here I can only ever be a flower under your protection." She fell silent for a moment, then spoke again in a voice that had suddenly grown steady and firm. "I want to have my own strength, to be a blade you can use, not just a vase that pours tea. I want to become the Empress of Kuja, to lead the Kuja pirates, and to plant our flag for you in the New World." Aaron Keel studied the fierce ambition burning in her eyes. He was quiet for a moment, then a slow smile spread across his face. Reaching out, he gently flicked her smooth forehead, the same gesture he had used years ago. "Go." At his blessing, Hancock's eyes reddened. She flung herself into Aaron's arms, then straightened and left the study without hesitation. A few months later, Aaron Keel was sprawled on the sofa, turning the pages of the morning paper. The front page was dominated by a single, enormous headline. "World shocked. Birth of the peerless beauty pirate empress. Kuja pirates achieve astonishing results on their first voyage. World government invites her to join the 7 warlords of the sea." Pinned to the article was a photograph of Boa Hancock's haughty profile. In the image, she looked down on the world, an aura of haughty radiating from her. Already the very image of an empress. Aaron Keel tossed the newspaper aside, a satisfied smile curling his lips. Thanks to his careful secrecy, the world government had no idea about his relationship with Hancock. 175. The Fall of the Grand Staircase. A salt-laced breeze swept over the reef and the shoreline of Shimotsuki village. A green-haired boy stood shirtless on the sand, gripping a wooden sword taller than he was with both hands, and kept swinging it at the waves. Sweat plastered his short hair to his forehead and ran down his cheeks, but he barely noticed, letting out a raw, animalistic shout as if he could split the vast sea in two. Each stroke took everything he had, the blade cutting the air with a sharp whistle. Still, the ocean made no concession. Waves smashed against the reef, broke into countless sheets of white foam, and flowed back out to sea. "Kid, your sword's crying." The boy froze mid-swing and whipped his head toward the voice. On a nearby outcrop, an old man with a single thick eyebrow sat cross-legged. He wore a plain kimono and squinted at the boy, a sake gourd set before him. "What did you say?" Zoro scowled. "I said." Shimotsuki Kushiro lifted the gourd and took a long pull, then set it back down. "Your sword's crying because you're using nothing but brute force. You're not wielding a sword, you're swinging a stick." Zoro's face went bright red. "What did you say? I'm training." Kushiro ignored the protest. He lifted a thin, withered finger and pointed to a distant reef, smoothed by years of ocean. "Everything has a breath. Listen, feel it. If you try to cleave that rock, you'll only shatter your wrist. But if you find its weakest grain, even an embroidery needle can split it." He said no more and returned to his sake. Zoro stood frozen, glancing from the reef to the bamboo sword in his hand. "Everything has a breath," the words repeated in his mind. He thought he understood, but only partly. Still, something inside him had been touched. He drew a slow breath, closed his eyes, and stopped shouting. Instead of bellowing and forcing power, he stood very still and listened, to the wind, to the rhythm of the waves, to the faint tremor in the bamboo. After a long, quiet moment, he opened his eyes and struck. This blow wasn't the earth-shattering force he'd used before. It was impossibly quick, leaving only an afterimage. The blade sliced through the air with a clean, ringing note. Zoro stared at his hands, his eyes flashing with sudden understanding. He bowed toward where the old man had gone, then snatched up his bamboo sword and dashed for the dojo. "Quina, let's spar again!" Inside the training hall, his shout rang out, full of energy. Quina set her shinai down and regarded him coolly. "You've lost 20 times already today, Zoro." "This time is different," he said, taking his stance. He replayed the insight from the seashore in his mind, lowering his center, every muscle taut like a drawn bow. "Ha!" With a sharp cry, he pushed off and lunged. He didn't swing wildly this time. He angled the bamboo sword in a deceptive line and drove it straight for Quina's chest. Quina only stepped half a pace to the left and flicked her wrist. The two bamboo swords met with a dull clang. Zoro felt the precision of her parry reroute his attack. The blow he'd assured himself would land skidded away. Before he could adjust, her shinai was already pressed cold against his throat. Once again, a single move. Zoro sank to his knees as the bamboo sword slipped from his hand. Why can't I ever beat you?" Zoro muttered into the night. Moonlight washed over the dojo like water. He and Quina sat side by side on the wooden steps. "Hey, do you really think girls can't become the world's greatest swordsman?" Zoro asked, his voice low and muffled. Quina hugged her knees and stared up at the moon without answering. Suddenly Zoro sprang to his feet, pointed at the sky, and shouted, "I will become the world's greatest swordsman. My name will ring out across the whole world. Let everyone know." Quina turned to look at him. The green-haired boy looked almost mad in the moonlight, and for the first time a flicker of feeling crossed her usually calm face. She rose as well and met Zoro's gaze. "People say girls are born weaker than boys, and that the gap only gets bigger as they grow," she said. "My father says that too." Her voice trembled, but there was steel in it. "But I absolutely disagree." She raised her famed sword, Wado Ichimonji, from her waist. Its scabbard gleamed like ivory in the moonlight. "Zoro, let's make a promise. One day, one of us will become the world's greatest swordsman." Zoro met the fierce light in her eyes and nodded hard. "Okay, it's a promise." When he got home, the frustration and gloom that had weighed on him vanished. He reached for a newspaper to catch up on the latest from the sea. A photograph dominated the front page. A man with hawk-sharp eyes, shouldering a massive black cross-shaped sword. The headline blared in bold type, "World's Greatest Swordsman, Hawkeye Mihawk, stationed at Saboti, dozens of challengers defeated." The article went on to describe how even swordsmen who had made names for themselves in the New World were unable to land a single meaningful strike before being bested. Hawkeye, Mihawk. Zoro traced the name with a shaking finger as his heart began to race. So there were swordsmen that powerful on the other side of the sea. The throne of the world's greatest swordsman was within reach. He clenched his fists. The thought of taking to the sea and seeking out stronger opponents sank into him and took root. At the Shimotsuki dojo, Quina finished her extra practice for the day, her keikogi soaked through with sweat. To shrug off what her father called her gender disadvantage, she pushed herself longer and harder than anyone else. She set Wado Ichimonji carefully back on the sword stand, wiped her brow, and let out a long, slow breath. Exhaustion rolled over her like a tide. Leaning against the wall, she prepared to climb the stairs to rest. The wooden steps gave a faint creak in the quiet night. As she stepped onto the last stair, her foot struck something and slipped. "Ah!" she gasped. Instantly, she lost her balance and tumbled down the stairs. For a moment, she felt weightless, and the world tilted. Images flashed through her mind. Her father's disappointed, regretful look, Zoro's pained cry, the cold hilt of Wado Ichimonji. "It's over," she thought, and closed her eyes, bracing for the sharp pain. It never came. Just before her body met the hard floor, she sank into a cold, strangely soft embrace. Something, an indescribable shadow, rose up from nowhere and cradled her back, taking the brunt of the fall. The relief lasted less than a second. Her head still slammed against the floor. Thud. Blackness swallowed her. When consciousness returned, Quina's eyelids fluttered, and she opened them slowly. The sharp tang of antiseptic filled her nose. Her head was wrapped in thick bandages, and a dull, persistent ache throbbed behind her eyes. She turned her head and took in the room, her own, dim and familiar. At the bedside, a green-haired boy sat slumped in a chair, asleep. 2 clear tear tracks ran down his cheeks. His eyes were red and swollen. Queena wiggled her fingers and let her memory piece itself back together. She remembered tumbling down the stairs, but something felt wrong. As she replayed that instant, a single, impossible image hovered at the edge of her recall, cold, soft, supporting her back like a shadow. Had that really happened, or was it a trick her head had played on her in the moment before she blacked out? Chapter 176. A Lonely Man, Windmill Village, East Blue. The roar inside Makino's bar threatened to lift the roof off. "Captain! Another barrel!" Lucky Roo bellowed, words slurring as he clutched a massive meat bone. "You fool!" Yasop snapped, giving him a kick in the rear, then turned to the counter. "Makino, fill one up for our captain, too. He's in a good mood today." Shanks rested his chin in his hand, smiling as he watched 2 small figures chasing each other outside the window. One was his adopted daughter, Uda. The other was Luffy, the village kid who dreamed of becoming a pirate. Makino returned his smile and slid a full glass of beer across the bar. "Mr. Shanks, your drink." "Thanks, Makino." Shanks tore his eyes away and took the glass. "Captain, don't just watch. Get in there." First Mate Ben Beckman, cigarette dangling from his mouth, lounged against the wall and drawled. "Makino's a good girl. If you don't make a move soon, somebody else will snatch her up." The crew exploded in laughter. Shanks nearly spat out his drink. "What nonsense are you talking about, Beckman?" someone barked. Ding-a-ling. The bell above the bar door chimed as a breeze rattled the wine chimes. A gentle-looking woman stepped in holding a small bouquet of freshly opened sunflowers. Behind her came a freckle-faced boy, eyes sharp and alert as he scanned the noisy pirates scattered through the room. "Makino, these are the flowers you ordered," the woman said softly as she handed the bouquet to the bar owner. "Thank you, Sister Luna," Makino replied. She found a vase, arranged the blooms, and set them on the counter. The woman went by Luna. A few years earlier, she and her son, Ace, had settled in Windmill Village and opened a little flower shop next to the bar. Luna was kind and gentle, the sort of single mother everyone in the village trusted. Shanks watched the boy. There was something in Ace's stubborn, unbending gaze that tugged at him, a resemblance not in looks but in spirit to someone long gone. He lifted his glass, crossed the room, and crouched down to the child's level. "Hey kid, want some juice?" Ace instinctively stepped behind his mother and peered out at Shanks, hand half raised in a protective motion. "Huh? Who are you?" he asked warily. "Ace, don't be rude." Luna gently patted her son's head and offered Shanks an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, he's a little shy." "Ha ha! It's all right." Shanks stood and a strange tug ran through him. There was something about this woman and her child that felt like the middle of a story he hadn't been told. He tried to sound casual. "Must be hard, raising a child on your own." Luna's smile faltered. She smoothed a hand over Ace's hair and stared out toward the sea, as if the horizon held the answer. "As long as he grows up safe, any hardship is worth it," she said softly. Shanks didn't press her. He felt the weight behind those words, an exhaustion and a stubborn hope, and he didn't want to pry. He looked at Ace again. The familiar ache of déjà vu washed over him once more, but he shook his head, chasing the thought away. Maybe it was just a coincidence. North Blue, Minion Island. A blizzard had swallowed the land, turning everything a relentless, despairing white. Rosinante trudged through the snow, a large wooden crate cradled against his chest. Each step sank deep into the drifts. Each breath came out in steaming clouds. Inside the crate, a small boy lay curled up in a ball. The pale splotches of amber lead syndrome had spread across half his cheek. His breathing was ragged and faint. "Rosinante," a voice called, thin through the wind. "Are we gonna die here?" Law's voice was raw, carrying a despair no boy his age should have to feel. They had been to every hospital in North Blue, but as soon as the doctors saw the pale white spots on Law, they pushed them out like they were contagious. "No, Law, trust me." Rosinante slipped and tumbled into a snowdrift. His cigarette dropped into the snow and went out. He scrambled up, brushed himself off, and forced a smile that looked more like a grimace than anything hopeful. "See, I'm fine." Law stared at him, wanting to laugh but unable to. The endless white all around seemed to swallow what little hope they had left. The Den Mushi in Rosinante's pocket suddenly buzzed. He froze, fumbled it out, and saw Doflamingo's private line flashing on the shell. He hesitated a moment, then pressed the receiver to his ear. Rosinante, the Den Mushi imitated, Doflamingo's voice, smooth and faintly menacing. Doffy, Rosinante answered, his own voice thin. On the other end, Doflamingo sat back on a dark throne, the conversation about the Opa no Mi finished. His face was lost in shadow, unreadable. Only the lenses of his glasses caught and reflected a cold, hard light. Doffy had a small, gnawing suspicion. His only blood brother was a marine spy. The call he just made was his last act of mercy for family. If Rosinante ate the devil fruit and then returned, Doffy could behave as if nothing had happened. Rosinante would remain his blood brother and his right hand in the Don Quixote family. Rosinante gripped the Den Mushi, thinking only of Law. The Opa no Mi might be Law's last hope. I understand, Doffy, he said quietly. He hung up and stared toward the transaction site, a blurred shape in the distance through the blizzard. His resolve hardened. Using his marine identity and the power of his calm fruit, he set off a massive explosion at the chaotic exchange. In the confusion that followed, he risked everything and snatched the box containing the Opa no Mi. He raced back to the rundown shack where they'd been hiding, clutching the precious fruit. Law! Quick, eat it! Rosinante shoved the heart-shaped devil fruit into the boy's mouth. Law gagged, eyes widening at the revolting taste, but he forced himself to swallow. An invisible sphere of silence closed around them, swallowing every sound. Inside that hush, Rosinante looked down at Law, who lay curled in the treasure chest, and offered a wide, blood-streaked smile. Law, I've cured your illness. You're free. The last words Law read on Rosinante's lips as he slid into unconsciousness were a simple, aching, I love you. Outside, in the whirling snow, Doflamingo advanced slowly. He stopped a few paces away and stared at his brother, who lay slumped in a spreading pool of blood, almost unrecognizable. Even his trademark sunglasses could not hide the turmoil warring behind them. Why, Rosie? His voice trembled in the blizzard. Why make me kill my own family? Rosinante leaned back against the chest heaving. He could not answer. He could only look at his brother with eyes that held no hatred, only sorrow. Rosinante had inherited the kindness and gentleness of their father, Saint Homing, while Doflamingo carried their father's celestial dragon blood. In the end, the two brothers had walked completely different roads. Doflamingo drew a pistol and leveled it. This is the path you chose, he said. He fired. The shot rang into the empty white, but within Rosinante's silent domain it was swallowed, unheard. Rosinante's body slowly sagged, a faint, almost foolish smile still on his face. With the last of his strength, he kept the calm domain alive, buying the boy in the treasure chest one final chance at life. Doflamingo stood motionless for a long moment, then turned and walked away. His figure in the blizzard looked achingly lonely. After an unknown time, the silence that had wrapped everything finally began to fade. The lid of the chest was pushed aside, and Law crawled out. He heard the wind, the distant footsteps of others, and the heartbreaking sobs caught in his own chest. He looked over at Rosinante, lying in the snow not far off, his body already stiffening, and tears streamed down his face. The boy stumbled and ran through the drifts. Behind him lay the hell he had wanted to escape from at any cost. Ahead only a future of solitude. The freedom Rosinante had bought with his life felt so heavy it made it hard to breathe. 177. Destiny's child Shanks had brought Uda to Elegia, the music kingdom, so she could pursue her dream of becoming a singer. But the kingdom that once rang with music was a ruin now, shattered walls and towering flames the only things left. The Red Hair Pirates' flagship, the Red Force, eased out of the harbor, and the air on deck felt heavy, almost suffocating. The crew moved in silence, tidying the wreckage left by the battle, but everyone instinctively kept their distance from the lone figure at the bow. Shanks stood there, the sea breeze ruffling his fiery short hair and his cloak snapping behind him. He didn't turn. The cries coming from the island behind him cut him like knives. Liar! Shanks, you big liar! I hate you! Those were Uda's words. His daughter, the one he treasured most, spewing the sharpest venom at him. Ben Beckman approached with an unlit cigarette between his fingers, said nothing, and simply fell in beside Shanks. Shoulder to shoulder, they watched the ruined kingdom recede into smoke. "Are we really going to do this?" Beckman asked at last, his voice low after a long silence. Shanks's answer was hoarse, stripped of everything but resolve. "It's the only way. She needs to be a singer, not a vessel for the Demon King. I'll bear this sin." To honor Uda's dream, Shanks had taken her to Elegia's sacred place of music. No one could have foreseen that her heavenly voice, born of the Sing-Sing devil fruit, would inadvertently unseal the ancient Demon King, Tot Musica. The resulting battle tore the country apart. Elegia was laid to ruin. Shanks could not let Uda carry the blame for the destruction of her homeland. He chose to become the villain. He put the unconscious Uda in the care of the sole surviving friend, Gordon, and accepted full responsibility for Elegia's downfall. When Uda came to, the first thing she saw was her home in ruins, and the man she had called father standing over it, his hands stained by the catastrophe. The misunderstanding was complete and irreversible. As the ship pulled away, Uta's cries faded and were swallowed by the sea. Shanks let them go. He shut his eyes slowly, sealing away the grief and the image of his daughter's determined stare deep inside him, a private burden he would carry alone. The trip back to the East Blue dragged on, long and uneventful. The crew's mood had turned quiet after the Elegia incident. Lucky Roo, usually the loudest aboard, sat alone on the rail, silently gnawing on a chunk of meat. That day, while they cut across an unnamed stretch of sea, the sky suddenly darkened. Without warning, a wall of swell rose up, and gale-force wind drove sheets of rain across the deck. "Storm!" someone yelled. "Steady the rudder! All hands brace! Lower the sails!" Under Beckman's orders, the men moved like a single machine, every action sharp and efficient as they fought to keep the ship on course. Then the lookout's voice cracked through the noise. "Ship ahead! It's a world government vessel." Through the curtain of rain, a frigate bearing the world government flag struggled in the troughs. Shanks walked to the rail, rain plastering his hair to his scalp. He stared at the other ship, and something hard and cold settled in his eyes, frustration with nowhere to go. The pirate's instinct to take what he could flare up inside him. "Looks like they're hauling something valuable," Yassop said, peering through his telescope, squinting against the rain. Shanks didn't answer. He simply drew his saber, Griffin, from his waist. "Lads," Shanks called, grinning wide and flashing a row of white teeth, his smile carrying a blade's edge of ruthlessness. "Right, let's give those government lackeys a little warmth." He slung his sword over his shoulder. Rain dripped from his flame-red hair. "Yeah!" came the shouted reply. The long-suppressed crew erupted in a thunderous roar, pirate blood ignited in an instant. The fight was over almost before it began. The CP frigate had no power to answer the red-hair pirates' onslaught and was torn apart in moments. "Chich! How dull!" Lucky Roo muttered, flicking his empty flintlock over his shoulder as he was the first to leap onto the ruined deck. The crew spread out, eager to sort through the spoils. Their enthusiasm curdled quickly. "Captain, these bums! There's not even a decent bottle of wine aboard," one complained. "This side is all trash, too rough even for toilet paper," another grumbled. "Hey, come look at this! I found a weird box!" someone shouted. Lucky Roo darted to the center of the deck, carrying a locked, ornate chest. Shanks strolled over, interest piqued. Beckman brought the butt of his rifle down on the lock with a sharp crack. The lid sprang open with a snap. Inside the box lay a thick swath of dark red velvet. Nestled in its center was a strange purple fruit, its surface carved with arabesque spirals. "This is a devil fruit?" someone breathed. "What an odd shape," another muttered. The crew pressed in, curiosity buzzing as they circled the box. But the sudden hush that fell over Shanks was absolute. His pupils pinched tight. For a moment he forgot the clamor of his men, the wind and rain on the deck, the roar of waves slamming against the hull. Everything receded until only the quiet fruit remained. He reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the spirals carved into its skin. It was the one. A voice screamed in his chest, and memories that had long been sealed burst through like a broken dam. He was back as an apprentice aboard Captain Rogers' ship, staring up with awe at those monstrous, powerful crewmates. And there was Cale, a man who seemed to have the word freedom carved into his bones, strong, steady, the group's backbone. Shanks had once believed, with the surety of youth, that Cale would be the one to carry the captain's will forward. After Captain Roger's death, Cale simply shrugged it off. He said he didn't care about One Piece. He only wanted to live his life at his own pace. He was too free for fate to pin down. That kind of freedom made even destiny useless. Shanks was different. He put on the straw hat Roger had entrusted to him, and with Buggy at his side, stood on the ship's rail and dreamed aloud of the future. They'd find One Piece together and make a new pirate king. For a time, he truly believed he was the child of destiny. How laughable that felt later. As fragments of overheard conversation and half-remembered remarks were pieced together, his conviction turned into the bitterest irony. He discovered his family name was Figureland, a celestial dragon surname. How could it be more absurd? A descendant of those who were treated like gods, meant to be the child of destiny who would overthrow the rule of gods and liberate the world. Doubt set in, and he began to search for answers. Snatches of rumor led him to Elbaf and to tales of a devil fruit tied to a so-called sun god. He went to Elbaf himself, called on an old friend named Jabba, and even witnessed the fall of giant King Harold. And still he could not so much as glimpse that fruit's shadow. He had been worn thin by his daughter's ordeal, nearly ready to abandon the search altogether. And then, in the most absurd way, the fruit had turned up. Not found by charting the Grand Line, or wrested from some mighty foe, but taken as random spoils, ripped from a government frigate caught in a storm. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. Shanks? Beckman's voice pulled him back from the spiral of thought. Shanks caught the question, and the worry flickering in his first mate's eyes, without answering. He snapped the box shut. The crisp click of the lock cut through the chatter and quieted the deck. Every crewman turned to their captain, trying to read the tangled expression he wore. Shanks said nothing. He tucked the box under his arm, turned, and walked back toward his cabin. There was a weight in his retreating figure that none of them could understand. Beckman took the cigarette from between his lips and watched the closed cabin door, his gaze unusually distant. After a long moment, he flicked the butt into the sea. The waves swell, load it. The storm, he murmured, doesn't seem to be over yet. Back in Windmill Village, life slipped back into its usual rhythm of noise and quiet. That purple fruit, whatever it meant about fate, had become a hot potato. I didn't want to look at it again until I knew what to do, so I shoved it to the back of my mind and went back to being red-haired Shanks, the man who loved to drink, throw feasts, and tease Luffy. Maybe the chase itself is a kind of obsession. When an obsession finally produces something, good or bad, people tend to relax. I needed time for the aftershocks of that fruit to die down. So there we were at Makino's bar, my crew and I drinking ourselves stupid. "Captain, one more round," someone shouted. "Ha ha ha, Yasop, you lost again." I laughed loud and easy, downing my beer and enjoying the quiet warmth of the moment. Ding-a-ling. Someone kicked the door open. The little wind chime at the entrance clattered like it had been insulted. A scarred-faced man swaggered in with a short sword at his waist and a handful of rough-looking henchmen behind him. His sneer cut through the good mood in the place. "We're mountain bandits," he announced, loud and arrogant, and the room went immediately tense. "Hand over all the booze." The man vaulted up onto the bar, scanning the room with a hard grin. "We're not like you soft-footed pirates playing house at sea." The tavern fell silent. I lifted a hand to halt them and held up an empty bottle, shaking it with an apologetic smile. "Oh dear, how unfortunate," I said. "Looks like we drank it all." The leader, Higuma, snatched the bottle and smashed it down on my head. The glass exploded. Beer and shards ran through my hair. He looked me up and down. "My bounty's 8 million berries," he announced. "I've taken down 56 men like you by myself." With the sheath of his sword, he swept plates and glasses from the table. They hit the floor in a harsh clatter. I didn't flinch. I just lowered my head and watched the mess. "Captain." Lucky Roo mumbled around a bite of meat. Still, I didn't move. Higuma's expression shifted from triumph to irritation. He spat, shrugged, and strode out with his men, laughing loudly. "Ha!" No sooner had they gone than I burst out laughing, loud and sudden, and my crew followed, the tavern erupting around us. "Captain, you look pathetic. 8 million berries? Scary, huh?" I wiped beer off my face. laughing so hard I could barely stand. It was beneath me to argue with a small-time loudmouth. Better to treat it as a joke and let everyone enjoy the show. "Shanks, why didn't you fight back?" someone jeered. An angry voice cut through the laughter. Luffy had appeared at my side without my noticing, cheeks flushed, fists curled tight. "Are you still a pirate or not? You don't fight back when someone bullies you." "It was just a bottle of sake, nothing to make a fuss about," I said, ruffling his hair. Then he spun around in a huff, reached into an open box on the bar, and, before I could stop him, stuffed something into his mouth in protest. At first I smiled, indulgent and amused. Then my grin died. The room dropped into a stunned hush. The box on the counter was empty. My eyes locked on the small, locked treasure chest I'd set there earlier, the one I had put away casually, the one that had been holding the gum-gum fruit. Luffy had seized it and shoved whatever was inside into his mouth. "Luffy, what did you eat? Spit it out." I grabbed his ankle and flipped him upside down. He wriggled, blinking at me with furious indignation, and made a choking, offended sound. "Ugh!" He gagged and tried to spit, but nothing came out. For a heartbeat, there was only the awful, absurd silence of the whole crew, realizing what had just happened. Then the truth hit like a punch to the gut. The fruit he'd just swallowed, the one that had been sitting in my chest, the gum-gum fruit, devil fruit. My hand tightened on his leg. The laughter that had filled the bar fell away, replaced by a cold, heavy quiet. Faces around me went pale. Even the jukebox seemed to stutter. No. My voice came too small. I felt the world lean. He ate it. He actually ate it. Luffy blinked up at me, unharmed, too proud and oblivious to the enormity of what he'd done. "I was just hungry," he said simply, the same child who eats everything in sight. I wanted to laugh and cry at once. The chest lay empty on the counter like an accusation. Once a devil fruit is swallowed, there's no taking it back. The consequences rolled over me with the weight of the sea. Outside, the lights of the harbor didn't know what had changed. Inside, everything had. "It tastes awful." Luffy's face went an ugly pig liver color. Then something strange happened. His body stretched like dough, and his cheek slapped down against the floor with a loud smack. "Ah!" The bar erupted in gasps. I let go, and Luffy's body snapped back into shape. He stared at his hand, baffled, then tugged and pulled until his cheek stretched out long. "Huh? My body?" For a moment, the world went completely quiet for me. I had searched for years, from the Grand Line to the New World, meeting the giant race, chasing down ancient legends, clashing with world government ships. And after all those twists and turns, the gum-gum fruit had finally ended up in my hands. The fruit I had convinced myself was fate had been eaten by a brat as an after-dinner snack. Fate be damned. I collapsed to the floor, my head ringing. For days I wandered around in a daze, watching that excited kid bounce and laugh because he had become a rubber man. My feelings were a tangle of anger, disbelief, and something like reluctant awe. Why him? A stupid kid who only knew how to jam food into his mouth? And then his name came back to me, clear as a bell. Monkey D. Luffy. The D. That was the D. That clan, like Captain Roger himself, was hated by the Celestial Dragons, labeled openly as the natural enemy of God. From the bits and pieces Kylogo let slip, I learned more. The boy's father had once saved me at God Valley, and Kylogo had somehow ended up bringing the child aboard. It clicked. Maybe this was all fate. "Shanks, I'm going to sea." Luffy barreled up to me that day, grinning with his hands on his hips as if announcing the most ordinary thing in the world. "When I go out, I'm going to find a crew that's stronger than yours. I'm going to become the Pirate King." He flashed a mouthful of white teeth. My chest tightened. Those words hit me like a memory. They were the same as the promise that man had made aboard the Oro Jackson years ago, the captain who swore something to the sea. I understood then. My role was never to be some chosen child of destiny. I was a guide, a messenger. My task was to pass on Captain Roger's will, this straw hat and this fruit that stands for freedom, to the next age. I looked at Luffy and wondered, would he be the next Joy Boy? Would he awaken the fruit into its Nika form and, with the freest of spirits, bring smiles back to this world? I didn't know. I wanted to believe it, but believing opened an even sharper question. I lifted my left arm. Hidden beneath ordinary clothes was a secret not even Beckman knew, a brand of the Figerland family, the mark of the God's Knights. How could a celestial dragon, a knight of God, become the guide for the Joy Boy who would liberate the world? I had to draw a clear line with my past. The chance came without warning. Higuma, the bandit I'd once taught a lesson, still bore ill intent. He kidnapped Luffy and fled to sea in a tiny boat. By the time I reached them, the boat had been capsized by a massive sea king. That enormous mudfish, lurking in the shallows, opened its blood-red jaws, ready to swallow the terrified boy whole. There was no time to think. I dove in and shoved Luffy aside. The giant maw snapped shut where he had been. Pain lanced through my left arm. I fixed the beast with a surge of Conqueror's Haki and it recoiled, and I held Luffy, wailing but alive in my arms. Even as my arm burned, my heart was oddly calm. I watched the Sea King go under with a faint smile. It had my left arm, the arm that bore my family's mark, in its mouth, and it sank beneath the waves. It was only a fish. Fish don't talk. Blood clouded the seawater. For the first time in my life, everything felt painfully clear. I had lost an arm, but I'd cut the chains that bound me. From that moment on, I was no longer a scion of the Figureland family. I was simply Shanks, captain of the red-haired pirates. I had staked everything on this brat named Luffy. I'd staked it on this new era. Time to go, Luffy. I said it to the sniffling boy on the dock. I smiled, took off my straw hat, and placed it on his head. I'm entrusting this to you for now. When you've become a great pirate, bring it back to me. I turned without looking back. The Red Force eased out of the harbor and Windmill Village shrank behind us. My crew watched the empty sleeve where my left arm had been. Their faces were complicated, but no one asked a question. I raised my remaining right hand and rubbed at the throbbing where the arm had been severed. I had put everything on the new world. Luffy, don't disappoint me. Chapter 179. From today on, we are brothers. Mount Corvo, a paradise for wild beasts. The quiet of the mountain path was shattered by a boy's protest. Let go of me, you old geezer. I'm going to be the Pirate King. A straw-hatted kid was being hauled up the trail like a sack of potatoes, arms and legs flailing. Marine hero Garp dragged him along with one large hand clamped firmly on the boy's head. The force made the youngster look half his size. The commotion was loud enough to send birds scattering from the trees. Shut up, Garp barked. From today on, this is your new home. He planted the boy on the ground outside a rough wooden house and shoved him forward. Train hard and become the strongest Marine, Garp muttered under his breath as he trudged up the porch. That damn Kyle. It's his fault Dragon went and joined the Revolutionary Army. Next time I see him, I'll teach him a lesson. He shoved the boy into the yard and yelled into the house, Dadan, I've brought you another problem. A plump woman burst out, a cigarette between her lips and fury on her face. Garp, I told you, this is a mountain bandit's house, not a daycare. Do you want me to raise your messes for you? Garp's expression didn't change. With all the casual matter-of-factness of a man used to delivering doom and declarations, he pointed at the sulking, straw-hatted child and said, He's my grandson. Take good care of him. Then, as if punctuating the statement with a private quirk, he picked his nose and walked off. Garp shrugged off Dadan's protests and gave the still struggling Luffy a fond, iron-handed thump before laughing and striding down the mountain, his retreating figure somehow impossibly dashing. Inside the house, a freckled boy with black hair sat polishing a steel pipe, sunlight catching his face. That was Ace. He often ended up at Dadan's place between his own adventures. Hey, my name's Luffy. Let's be friends, Luffy announced, a huge bump on his head and not a clue in the world. Ace didn't even bother to look up. Mama Rouge fretted that he had no playmates in the village, but Ace simply had no interest in that goofy, straw-hatted kid. Give up wasn't in Luffy's vocabulary. From then on, Mount Corvo became the scene of a months-long pursuit. Luffy was like a piece of sticky candy you couldn't get off your fingers. No matter how Ace rejected him, threatened him, or rigged traps, Luffy would reappear the next day, bruised, bandaged, but unfailingly smiling and declaring, Let's be friends. That persistence might have just been an annoyance, if not for the day Luffy, wandering off, stumbled into the Gray Terminal, the world's junkyard, and accidentally uncovered a secret tying Ace to another blonde boy, Sabo. They were counting the loot they'd scavenged from around the island, setting it aside for the day they'd finally sail the sea. Trouble came sooner than they expected. The Blue Jam pirate crew, who had made the place their base, captured them. The pirates beat Luffy and demanded to know where the treasure was. He was bruised and bloody, but he clenched his teeth and would not say a word. He had only one thought. If he told, he'd never be able to be friends with Ace. That night, Ace and Sabo returned and found Luffy hanging, barely alive. Why? Wouldn't you tell? Ace's voice trembled before he even realized it. Luffy managed a grin. Blood and dirt smeared across his face, but the smile was startlingly pure. I don't want to be alone anymore, he said. Being alone hurts more than getting hurt. Ace felt as if his chest had been struck. From that night on, the three boys' paths were bound together. They built a secret base in the forest, hunted giant boars side by side, bathed and swam in the river, and shared whatever game they caught. To the boys, Dodon's wooden house was more like a little inn where they could recharge, while Rouge's flower shop in the village felt like a harbor to return to after another reckless adventure. Rouge complained constantly about the three troublemakers who kept wandering into the dangerous mountains, but she would still quietly stitch up the torn clothes of the mud-splattered brats. When they came back battered and bruised, she'd mutter as she produced her medicine box, but her hands were always impossibly gentle. In front of her, Ace lost every sharp edge he kept for the world. He became an ordinary sunny child, easy and warm. Garp's so-called fist of love landed with reliable regularity, leaving fresh bumps on each of their heads. You three, he thundered, you must grow up to be the strongest Marines. I don't want to, Luffy protested, clutching his head against the latest blow. I'm going to be the Pirate King. What did you say? Garp's fist came down again. Then he turned to the quiet boy at his side. Ace, what about you? Ace said nothing. He lowered his head and clenched his fists. That night, at the boys' hidden base, only the campfire crackled into the dark. I hate that damn father I never even met. Ace murmured to the flames, as if speaking to Sabo, and partly to himself. Mama said he was a free man, but to me he was just an irresponsible coward. Leaving Mama like that, he's no father of mine. I'll never acknowledge him. He drew a breath and his voice hardened with resolve. So I'm going to become a Marine. I'll be everything he wasn't. Sabo watched him without a word, then glanced over at Luffy, who was sprawled asleep beside them and drooling in his sleep. One boy wanted to be the Pirate King, one wanted to be a Marine, and Sabo, he only wanted to break out of the gilded cage called nobility and taste true freedom. Their dreams were all different, yet they pointed to the same place, out to sea. Hey, let's become sworn brothers, Sabo said suddenly. That way, no matter where we end up or what names we take, we'll always be brothers. He produced, as if from nowhere, a stolen bottle of sake and 3 little cups. If we drink this sake together, we'll be brothers forever. At that, Luffy shot upright, eyes bright. Brothers! Yay! Ace looked at his 2 companions. A real smile finally broke across his face. He picked up the sake bottle and solemnly poured into the 3 small cups. No matter what happens in the future, no matter where we are, this bond will never change. From today on, we are brothers. The 3 cups clinked together with a bright, clear sound. They tipped their heads back, ready to drain the sake, when a gentle but unyielding hand came down and pressed their heads down. Oh my, sneaking adult sake isn't something good children should be doing. A soft female voice spoke from above. The 3 froze, then slowly looked up. Standing over them was a kind-faced woman with waist-length pink hair, smiling gently. It was Rouge, the woman who had come from Windmill Village to visit Ace, and who now went by Luna. El Luna Auntie, Luffy cried so loudly he dropped his cup. Ace went even redder and averted his eyes. Mama, we were just... Becoming sworn brothers is a good thing, Rouge said, her smile never leaving her face, but her words carried a chilling steadiness. But sneaking sake is a different matter. The next instant, all 3 of them yelped as she twisted their ears at once. Ah, Mama! Ow, ow, ow! Aunt Luna, I'm sorry. My ear's going to be twisted right off. It's going to stretch out. Ah! Their shrieks rang out across Mount Corvo. 3 rascals who would one day shake the world. From below, a warm voice called up, Hurry up, dinner's going to get cold. I made your favorite barbecue at Aunt Didane's today. With that, she turned and headed down toward the wooden house. Moonlight stretched her shadow long across the path. Ace, Sabo, and Luffy glanced at one another, took in the bedraggled state of each other's faces, and burst out laughing together. They abandoned the eagerly anticipated bottle of sake, rubbed their aching ears, and sprinted after the gentle figure down the slope. "Wait for us. Barbecue, mine's mine. Mama, go a little slower." In the mountain woods, 3 small silhouettes trailed behind Rouge, their shadows lengthening and overlapping in the moonlight until they seemed almost one. Chapter 180. Greetings from Morgus. Inside Kyle's office on the Sabaudi archipelago, Kyle lounged in a plush swivel chair and was using his feet to push off the floor, making both himself and the chair spin faster and faster. "Boring. Utterly boring," he muttered. He stared up at the ceiling, letting the room blur as he tried to shake the fog from his thoughts. Ever since the clash at Mary Geoise, the world government had taken a colder, more distant approach. The seas had settled into an uneasy calm, and a man who thrived on chaos and excitement felt positively restless. The door creaked open. Karen stepped in, carrying a cup of black tea, and froze at the sight of his lord twirling in the chair. The android's metallic jaw worked, opening and closing, and his eyes shone with fervor. Of course, Lord Kyle wasn't just spinning for fun. He was mimicking the movement of the heavens, probing the subtle fluctuations of the world. By aligning his own wave with the world's currents, he was reaching a supreme harmony with nature itself. Ordinary people might see only a silly man in a chair, but Lord Kyle had long ago perceived the essence beneath the surface. As expected of Lord Kyle, Kyle caught sight of the newcomer from the corner of his eye. His spinning chair let out a harsh screech and came to an abrupt stop, nearly throwing him forward from the sudden inertia. "Cough, cough!" He steadied himself with a hand on the desk, straightened his collar with deliberate calm, and wore an expression that tried very hard not to look flustered. "Karen, do you need something?" "Lord, your black tea." Karen set the cup down with a bow, then handed over a denmushi that was vibrating, buru-buru, and sporting a little bird-like face topped with a tiny top hat, its expression painfully obsequious. Kyle glanced at the caller ID. Morgan's. He hadn't even settled the score with that pompous, feathered fellow, and now Morgan's was practically delivering himself right to his office. Kyle took the den-mushi and pressed the answer button. "Lord Kyle," Morgan's voice poured out in one grandiose gush. "Your loyal partner, Morgan's, president of the World Economic News, offers his most sincere greetings. Your renown is like a lighthouse in the darkest night, guiding us poor lost sheep." Kyle scratched his ear and held the receiver at arm's length, listening. A big part of his foul mood came down to one bird. The seas had been calm lately, and there hadn't been any major stories to run, so sales at the World Economic News had tanked. Morgan's, clever, shameless Morgan's, had decided to fix the paper's numbers by making him the story. The bird wrote a long piece comparing him to legendary pirates like Whitebeard and Golden Lion, hinting all the way through that Aaron Kyle was the undisputed, strongest man in the world since the start of the great pirate era. Kyle didn't mind the flattery. He'd even enjoyed it at first. Then Morgan's went and changed tack at the end, bringing up the strongest woman in the world, Charlotte Linlin. The paper's flourish read like a tabloid fever dream. When the strongest man meets the strongest woman, what earth-shattering sparks will fly? According to exclusive reporting, wave-guiding King Aaron Kyle and Big Mom Charlotte Linlin have long admired one another, a hero loving a hero, a queen cherishing a champion. A legendary romance that could reshape the world's balance may be quietly unfolding. Quietly unfolding my foot. My ass! When Kyle first saw the headline, he almost yanked Needhog from its sheath and crawled down the communication line to smash Morgan's skull personally. What on earth did Morgan's mean by pairing him with that old woman who had dozens of children? With Prometheus, he could feel his blood boil, and the line was already jammed with gossip. Back during the clash at God Valley, Charlotte Linlin could still be called a peerless heroine. Now, in her bloated, ravenous stomach demon form, she was unbearable to behold. The paper's story had set the town aflame. Sales had skyrocketed, and everyone was buzzing about this fabricated strongest alliance. "Kyle," he finally snapped into the den-mushi, voice low and flat. "You flat-feathered beast, have you lost your mind?" On the other end, Morgan's trembled. The little den-mushi trembled with him, its face suddenly terrified. "Misunderstanding. It's all a huge misunderstanding, Lord Kyle, he stammered. Everything I printed was meant to boost your reputation, to make the whole world see you as the era's true protagonist. As for that old hag, Charlotte Linlin, how could she be worthy of you? I only used her to make you look greater by comparison. Oh, so I'm supposed to be grateful? Kyle's tone was dry. I wouldn't dare, Morgan's blurted out, panic bleeding through every word. I wouldn't dare. Morgan's voice trembled, on the verge of tears. I know I've made a terrible mistake. I deserve to die 10,000 deaths. To show my remorse, I'll trade something of real value, only ask that Lord Kyle spare me this once. Kyle lifted his cup of black tea and blew gently over the surface. Tell me. If it doesn't satisfy me, I'll turn you into a roasted chicken and send you to Charlotte Linlin's tea party. It will satisfy you. I swear it will. Morgans felt a chill run down his neck and rattled the words out like a nervous drum. My informants are everywhere. My lord, they hear things others don't. I have a few pieces of news you might find interesting. He cleared his throat. The Den Mushi on the table stiffened its stalk as if listening too. First, about the 7 warlords of the sea. After the world government's humiliating loss at Mary Gioa's, their authority has taken a hit. My man at Marineford says Fleet Admiral Sengoku is pushing hard to revitalize the Shichibukai system to counterbalance the rising number of pirates on the seas. Right now, several candidates have come into focus, Morgan said. Among them are Boa Hancock, who recently took the throne as Empress of Kuja Island, and Doflamingo, Ten Yasha, the head of the Don Quixote family. There's also the Sand Crocodile, who's achieved notoriety in the Alabasta Kingdom. Kyle lifted his teacup and took a sip. Isn't that obvious? They're all my people. Of course I know them. Crocodile, though, was a curious inclusion. Second, regarding the Revolutionary Army, Morgans lowered his voice. Ever since the Mary Gioa's incident, the Revolutionary Army's momentum has exploded. Uprisings have sprung up in kingdom after kingdom, and Monkey D. Dragon's prestige is approaching what Pirate King Roger had at his height. But they've run into a particularly troublesome adversary. The world government has put together a new intelligence unit, codenamed CP0, specifically tasked with handling the nastier jobs. Among them is a young genius named Rob Lucci, Morgan said. Cold-blooded, ruthless, and terrifyingly strong, he's already given the Revolutionary Army plenty of trouble. Lucci, huh? Kyle murmured, picturing the man who would one day put so much pressure on the Straw Hat. He hadn't expected Excitement Brother to turn up so early, and it was a pity that the man later rose to a high-ranking post, his mouth as hard as iron. Morgan's voice brightened. Third, and what I think is the most important piece of information, he leaned in, it's about a devil fruit. Kyle sat up. Oh, a devil fruit that could tip the balance of the whole world. The Logia-type rumble fruit. Morgan's tone brimmed with temptation. This legendary fruit has surfaced on Sky Island. Whoever gets it is said to have the power of a god. Kyle set his teacup down, fingertips tapping the table. Rumble fruit. Eneru. Morgans chuckled. And finally, a little rumor I'm tossing in as a bonus. In the East Blue, there's a very interesting newcomer, someone you might know. He's a red-nosed clown who claims he once served on the Pirate King's ship. Oddly enough, he's beaten several well-known veteran pirates and is practically worshipped by the nearby villagers. His bounty's already up to 5 million berries. His name is Buggy.